Section 1. Where it all began. The Christmas card that started a war. Go back to December of 1992. Two film students at the University of Colorado are sitting in a dimly lit editing room, not thinking about legacy or television deals or cultural impact. They are thinking about how to make each other laugh. One of them, Trey Parker, has already won a Student Academy Award for an animated short called American History, which he made using nothing more than construction paper, a bottle of craft glue, and one of those chunky 8mm film cameras that smells faintly of motor oil. His collaborator, Matt Stone, is the kind of person who seems incapable of taking anything seriously, and together they make a pair that most reasonable observers would describe as probably a little too much. What they make that December is a 5-minute short film. Nothing fancy. The animation is rough. In the way that truly handmade things are rough, you can almost feel the paper edge when the characters move. The plot is simple enough. 4 young boys accidentally bring a snowman to life, and then Jesus shows up, as one does. The violence is absurd, the language is appalling, and the whole thing costs almost nothing to make. They premiere it at a student film screening on campus. It gets some laughs, and then it basically disappears, filed under "funny thing we made once." For 3 years, that is the end of the story. But then, in 1995, a Fox broadcasting executive named Brian Graydon sees the original short, and something in his brain catches fire. He reaches out to Parker and Stone with a very specific and very unusual request. He wants them to make a new version of the short, same basic idea. 4 foul-mouthed kids, religious imagery, crude animation, and he wants to send it to his friends as a video Christmas card. His budget for this is $2,000. Parker and Stone reportedly spend about $750 of it actually making the film, keeping the rest as their commission, which is extremely on brand for two people who would go on to spend the next 3 decades satirizing every form of institutional greed they could find. This new version, which would later be known informally as Jesus versus Santa, swaps out the snowman villain for St. Nicholas himself. The argument between Jesus and Santa about the true meaning of Christmas escalates quickly, the way arguments tend to in South Park, into a full-scale street brawl, while 4 construction paper children watch with varying degrees of horror and enthusiasm. Kenny, who would become famous across 28 seasons of the actual show, dies here for the first time. Kyle is Jewish. The DNA of everything that came after is already present in these 5 minutes. Graydon sends the tape to roughly 80 friends in December of 1995. One of those friends is rumored to have been George Clooney, which is one of those details that seems too perfectly absurd to be true, but has never been convincingly denied. From there, the tape gets copied, then copied again. Someone digitizes it, a remarkable act of technological initiative in a year when most people's internet experience consisted of waiting 12 minutes for a JPEG to load, and puts it online. And with that, something strange and unprecedented begins to happen. This crude, unlicensed, utterly unauthorized construction paper cartoon about Jesus and Santa Claus punching each other while children swear starts spreading across the early internet, passed from email inbox to email inbox, from shared drive to shared drive, the way things went viral before the word viral existed. People were huddling around office computers in groups, genuinely crowding around a monitor to watch a file that had taken the better part of a workday to download. They would watch it, erupt into laughter, and immediately start thinking about who else needed to see this. Hollywood executives were showing it in meetings. Film students were burning it onto discs and selling copies. Copies of copies of copies circulated through the entertainment industry like contraband, each generation slightly grainier than the last, none of them authorized by anyone. Parker and Stone had no idea what they had started. As Trey Parker later told Entertainment Weekly, they were at bars, trying to pick up people by mentioning that they'd made the spirit of Christmas. They were local micro-celebrities, in a world that hadn't quite figured out what to do with the thing they'd accidentally created. Comedy Central noticed. The network's executive Doug Herzog watched the short and saw something in it that the focus groups and the development meetings would later fail to capture. A genuine, unmediated, unpolished voice that didn't exist anywhere else on television. Comedy Central's president of programming, Eileen Katz, became the show's most important early champion. She later told Variety, and this is a quote worth savoring, that hearing the pitch, reading the script, and watching the footage felt like the planets aligning, birds singing, rainbows appearing, which is a remarkable thing to say about a show whose first episode would be called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. But Katz wasn't wrong. The planets were aligning. They were just aligning around something that was about to make a very large number of people very uncomfortable. Development moved forward, and even before a single frame aired, there was trouble. The first focus group that watched the pilot reportedly hated it with such conviction that their formal recommendation was to throw the whole thing in the trash. "Throw it away," they said. "Do not air this." Comedy Central, to their lasting credit, ignored this advice completely. Before we go any further, drop a comment down below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. There's something genuinely lovely about knowing that someone is listening to this from a completely different corner of the world. If you haven't subscribed yet, tap that button. It helps more than you know, and it means you won't miss anything we put out. There is something worth pausing on here, in this moment, before the show even exists, because it sets up everything that comes after. South Park was controversial before it was a show. The spirit of Christmas spread without permission, reached people who never asked for it, and provoked strong reactions: laughter, shock, delight, offense, before anyone had even considered the possibility of a television series. The controversy wasn't added later as a strategy. It was baked into the original thing, the way flour is baked into bread. You can't remove it without destroying what the thing is. Parker and Stone didn't learn to be controversial. They didn't workshop it or test it with audiences or run it past legal. The controversy is structural. It comes from the decision to put a fist fight between Jesus and Santa in front of 4 children, who respond to it with profanity-laced commentary. That decision was made in 1,992 inches an editing room at the University of Colorado, before anyone imagined it would matter to anyone outside that room. Everything else, the death threats, the government bans, the White House press releases, the billion-dollar deals, everything else is just consequences. The show premiered on Comedy Central on the 13th of August, 1997. The time slot was 10:00 inches the evening. The Nielsen rating for the first episode was a 1.3, which translated to roughly 980,000 viewers. For a cable channel that most of America was still figuring out how to access, that was considered a significant audience. Within weeks, the numbers would climb. Within months, they would become something cable television had never seen before. But before any of that happened, there was the matter of what was actually in the pilot episode. The title, as mentioned, was Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. That title alone, those 4 words, tells you more about what Parker and Stone were doing than most critical essays manage in several thousand words. They were not trying to ease anyone in. They were not building towards something shocking. They began with the most provocative possible statement they could make, and assumed that anyone still watching after the opening credits deserved everything that followed. The episode featured language that had never been heard in American animation before. It featured content that most networks had never seriously considered for broadcast at any hour. And it was rendered in an animation style so deliberately crude, so studiously childlike, that the contrast between the visual innocence and the content produced a specific kind of cognitive dissonance that no other show had ever managed. It looked like something a kindergartner might make. It sounded like something that kindergartner's deeply troubled uncle might narrate. Ray Richmond, reviewing the show for Variety in August of 1997, wrote that South Park was Peanuts meets A Clockwork Orange. That description is still, nearly 30 years later, the most accurate shorthand anyone has ever produced. The innocence of children's animation, the construction paper, the simple shapes, the wide eyes colliding with content so adult, so aggressive, so deliberately transgressive, that the combination produces something that doesn't quite fit into any existing category. The show was a hit. The controversies were already underway, and none of it was going to stop for a very, very long time. Section 2. The first season firestorm fart jokes and the forces of decency. Comedy Central moved the show to midnight, starting in October of 1997, after complaints poured in following the initial 10 p.m. time slot. This decision has a certain elegant logic to it. The show was too controversial for prime time, but too popular to cancel, so they shunted it into the late-night hours, where, in theory, fewer children and sensitive adults would encounter it. In practice, the audience kept watching. The ratings kept climbing. Moving a show to midnight to reduce its reach sometimes reduces its reach. Moving South Park to midnight mostly just gave teenagers a bedtime deadline to stay up past. The Parents Television Council had opinions about this. The PTC, which had been founded in 1995 and would go on to become one of the most persistent critics of South Park over the following decades, began calling for the show's cancellation almost immediately after the pilot aired. They called it so offensive, it shouldn't have been made. Not offensive and poorly made, or offensive without artistic merit. Just, this show should not exist. The PTC would maintain this position in various formulations for the next 3 decades, and South Park would respond to this position in various formulations by continuing to air. Schools in New Jersey launched campaigns to warn parents. Elementary schools in Georgia issued outright bans on South Park clothing. Children were showing up to class in Cartman shirts and getting sent home, and the school administrators sending them home were doing so with the righteous conviction of people who had clearly thought very little about what banning a cartoon character from a t-shirt would actually accomplish in the long run. There is a detail from 1999 that I genuinely love and find genuinely disturbing in equal measure. A poll conducted by NatWest Bank in the United Kingdom surveyed 8- and 9-year-old children about their favorite personalities. Not favorite cartoon characters, favorite personalities. As in, the people and entities they most admired. And Eric Cartman, the show's most morally depraved main character, a 10-year-old boy who is by any reasonable assessment an anti-Semitic, racist, manipulative sociopath. This child, this construction paper nightmare of a human being, came out as the most popular personality among British children under 10, beating actual human beings. Parent councils across the United Kingdom erupted. The headmaster of a school in Cambridge issued a public statement urging parents to restrict access to the show. And the thing that I keep returning to, the thing that I find genuinely fascinating about this, is what it says about the genius of Cartman as a character. Trey Parker and Matt Stone created someone so perfectly, comprehensively awful, that his awfulness became magnetic. Children didn't like him despite his terrible qualities. They liked him because of them, or at least because of how completely he committed to having them. Cartman never equivocates. He never apologizes. He wants what he wants, and he pursues it with a terrifying, undiluted focus that reads, to an 8-year-old, as confidence. The controversy generated by Cartman's popularity was actually more interesting than the controversy generated by any individual episode, because it was a controversy about what the show was doing to its audience at a deep level, not just putting bad words in their ears, but potentially modeling a certain approach to life. One school of thought said that children watching Cartman was obviously dangerous because they would imitate him. The counterargument was that Cartman is so cartoonishly awful that any child old enough to enjoy the show is old enough to understand they're watching a satire, not a role model. Both arguments were probably correct for different children, which didn't make the controversy easier to resolve. What often gets lost in the retrospective discussion of Season 1 is the episodes that weren't controversial, or rather, the episodes that were controversial in the opposite direction, not for being too crude, but for being unexpectedly thoughtful. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, which aired on the 3rd of September 1997, just 3 weeks after the pilot, featured one of the most genuinely sympathetic portrayals of a gay character that had appeared on American television at that point. Big Gay Al is happy, fully realized, unashamed of who he is, and the episode treats his identity with a warmth that many shows with far more serious intentions had failed to achieve. The episode received a GLAAD Media Award nomination for Outstanding Television Individual Episode. 3 weeks into the run of a show that was being called the worst thing to happen to children since lead paint, and it was getting nominated for a GLAAD Award. That tension between the vulgarity and the genuine empathy underneath it, between the shock content and the actual moral seriousness, is the engine that has kept the show running for nearly 30 years. Critics who write off South Park as pure shock value miss this. Critics who praise South Park as purely sophisticated satire also miss it. The show is both things simultaneously, and the discomfort produced by that combination is, in a sense, the point. The first time Comedy Central self-censored the show came early the 5th episode, An Elephant Makes Love to a Pig, which aired on the 10th of September, 1997. The episode featured a subplot in which Stan's older sister, Shelley, bullied him. In the original version, there were scenes of Shelley repeatedly setting Stan on fire and then dousing him with water, only to set him on fire again, keeping him alive specifically so the torment could continue. Comedy Central pulled this scene after the initial broadcast, citing concerns about the same kind of backlash Beavis and Butthead had faced over similar content years earlier. On the DVD releases, you can still see the outline of a puddle of water beneath Stan, a ghost of the deleted scene. On the Blu-ray releases, even that's been removed. It's such a small thing, a puddle of water in a cartoon, but it tells you something important about where Comedy Central's head was at in those early weeks. They were nervous. They had greenlit something genuinely unprecedented, and they were watching the reaction with the specific anxiety of a person who has said something irrevocable at a party and is still waiting to see how everyone else takes it. The 6th episode, Death, which aired on the 17th of September, 1997, introduced Terrence and Phillip, the flatulent Canadian comedy duo who exist as a show, within the show, that the children love and the South Park parents despise. The joke, barely concealed, is that the parents' reaction to Terrence and Phillip is a direct mirror of the real-world reaction to South Park itself. Parents in the episode are horrified by the vulgarity and what it's doing to their children. Parents in the real world were, at that exact moment, horrified by the vulgarity and what it was doing to their children. The show was commenting on its own controversy less than 2 months into its run, with a self-awareness that most shows take years to develop, if they develop it at all. There's a production detail from the first season that captures something essential about what Parker and Stone were building. The pilot episode, the actual first episode, was animated using real construction paper, physical paper, actual glue, an old camera, the same technique as the original Spirit of Christmas shorts. But every episode after that was produced digitally, using software designed to mimic the look of the paper cutout style. The show has looked like construction paper for nearly 30 years. It has been actually made of construction paper for exactly 1 episode. This matters because the handmade look isn't just an aesthetic choice, it's a philosophical one. The crude, childlike appearance of South Park is doing specific work. It creates a buffer of unreality between the content and the viewer. When Cartman says something anti-Semitic in a real-world context, it's potentially damaging and ugly. When a piece of construction paper says it, a certain distance is maintained. The medium provides, as Parker once described it, a kind of permission slip, the same way an editorial cartoon can depict things that would be unacceptable in a photograph. The problem, which Parker and Stone have always acknowledged even as they've declined to see it as their problem to solve, is that not everyone accepts the permission slip. Some people look at the crude animation and see something that pulls children in with its apparent innocence before delivering content they aren't equipped to understand as satire. The childlike look doesn't protect all children equally. This was, and remains, the most honest and difficult controversy South Park has ever generated. Not any single episode, not any single joke, but the foundational question of whether a show that looks like children's programming and is marketed through child-friendly characters can ever be fully absolved of responsibility for what children take from it. Parker and Stone have always maintained that the show is made for adults and shouldn't be watched by children, which is true. It's also true that children watched it anyway, in enormous numbers. From the very beginning, the merchandise was everywhere. The characters were on backpacks and lunchboxes. The show existed in cultural spaces that children naturally inhabited. There is no clean resolution to this. It was a genuine ethical tension, and it still is. And acknowledging that doesn't require condemning the show. It just requires being honest about the full picture. By the time Season 1's finale aired, ratings had climbed to a 6.4. The show was setting cable records. The PTC was calling for cancellation. British children were voting Cartman their favorite personality. Schools were banning T-shirts. Comedy Central was considering its midnight time slot a masterstroke of damage control. And Trey Parker and Matt Stone were already planning something that would make all of the previous controversies seem almost quaint. Section 3. The April Fool's Massacre when the show pranked its own audience. By early 1998, South Park was not merely popular. It was a phenomenon of a specific and rare kind. The kind where people who would normally never talk to each other find themselves discussing the same thing. Executives in Hollywood, teenagers in Colorado, parents in New Zealand, British children with a baffling preference for fictional sociopaths. The show had penetrated culture in a way that felt almost physical, like pressure. Comedy Central was growing at a speed that even its most optimistic projections hadn't anticipated. The number of American households with access to the network jumped from 9.1 million in 1997 to 50 million by June of 1998. That is not a normal growth curve. That is a show dragging a network into relevance through sheer force of controversy and word of mouth. Season 1 had ended on a cliffhanger. The finale, titled Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, the entire title, every word of it had presented a central mystery. Who, exactly, was Eric Cartman's father? The episode built to the revelation and then stopped, holding the answer back, instructing viewers to tune in to the Season 2 premiere to find out. This was a calculated move, and it worked beautifully. People were genuinely invested. The question of who fathered a construction paper child was, for a brief period in early 1998, among the more burning questions in American pop culture. The Season 2 premiere was scheduled for the 1st of April, 1998, April Fool's Day. In retrospect, the date should have been a warning. The episode begins exactly as promised. There's a recap of the Season 1 finale, clips from the cliffhanger, the tension building in the way cliffhangers are supposed to build tension, and then a title card appears. Not the resolution of the mystery. A title card that reads, "Not Without My Anus," followed by the words, "Starring Terrence and Phillip." And then, printed beneath that, "Happy April Fool's Day." What follows is 22 minutes of Terrence and Phillip, the flatulent Canadian comedy duo trying to stop Saddam Hussein from taking over Canada. There are fart jokes, many, many fart jokes. There is no Stan, no Kyle, no Cartman, no Kenny, no answer to the question of Cartman's father. Just farts for 22 minutes, while America's most invested South Park fans sat in front of their televisions, realizing they had been deliberately, specifically, and thoroughly pranked. The reaction was a kind of controlled detonation. Comedy Central received over 2,000 angry emails within a week. The phones were jammed. A Comedy Central spokesman later admitted, with what must have been enormous restraint, that the fans got the joke but simply didn't like it. The trade press covered it like a small disaster. Newsday's critic wrote that fans had rioted and that some had jumped ship and never came back. Fans who had been invested in the show since the pilot felt personally betrayed. Matt Stone's response, delivered to Entertainment Weekly, is one of the most perfectly composed pieces of trolling in television history. He said, approximately, "If you get that angry about not knowing who a construction paper child's father is, there is genuinely something wrong with you." He wasn't wrong, and he also wasn't really the point. The point was never whether the audience's emotional investment was rational. Of course, it wasn't rational. That's what makes the prank both funny and cruel. In equal measure, it found the exact spot where genuine affection had built up and poked it with a stick. People were mad because they cared. Parker and Stone had made them care, and then used that care as material. The actual resolution of the Cartman's father mystery came 3 weeks later, on April 22nd, with an episode called Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut. The episode pulled an 8.2 Nielsen rating at the time. That made it the highest-rated non-sports program in basic cable history. The prank, as infuriating as it had been, had apparently made people want the payoff even more. If you deny an audience something they want, and then give it to them, the satisfaction is elevated by exactly the measure of the denial. Parker and Stone had discovered, possibly by accident, but more likely by instinct, a principle about audience psychology that would inform every major creative decision they made for the next 27 years. Controversy sells. Specific, targeted, self-generated controversy aimed at your own audience with surgical precision sells extremely well. The best kind of controversy, they had discovered, is the kind you create yourself. During the spring of 1998, 8 of the 10 highest-rated shows on basic cable were South Park episodes. Not 8 of the 10 in their time slot. 8 of the 10, period, across all of cable television. Meanwhile, the merchandise was everywhere, and the controversy around it was developing its own distinct flavor. Parker and Stone's characters appeared on t-shirts in Target, on hats in J.C. Penney. The licensing arm expanded to major retailers. And then J.C. Penney ended its South Park tie-ins in April of 1999 after customer complaints. Fast food chains, which will happily put their logo on almost anything, mostly declined to associate with the show at all. The content that made the show a cultural phenomenon was the exact same content that made it toxic to mainstream brands. There is something genuinely interesting in this dynamic that would repeat across the show's entire history. South Park has always been too popular to ignore and too controversial to fully embrace. It exists in a kind of commercial limbo, generating enormous revenue while simultaneously making the normal machinery of cultural monetization uncomfortable. The show became one of the most successful properties in television history, partly because it could never be fully domesticated. Even the behind-the-scenes content was controversial. Parker and Stone recorded commentary tracks for every season, one episode, intended for the DVD release. Comedy Central refused to include them. The commentary, apparently, contained material that violated the network's own standards. Parker and Stone refused to allow the tracks to be edited. A standoff ensued. Eventually, the commentary was released on a separate CD, entirely independent from the DVD release. The behind-the-scenes material about a show that was too controversial for television was itself too controversial for the DVD release of that show. This is South Park. Controversial all the way down, even in its most ancillary and supplementary forms. Section 4. The movie that broke the MPA, 399 profanities, and an Oscar nomination. The announcement that South Park was getting a feature film came during the first season, around January of 1998. Parker and Stone signed a deal with Comedy Central that covered both the continuing series and a theatrical film. Their conditions for the film were non-negotiable. It had to receive at least an R rating, not PG-13, not something family-friendly. At minimum, R. They wanted to do things in a movie theater that they couldn't do on cable television, and they intended to use every inch of the latitude the R rating would provide. Paramount Pictures, which was distributing the film, initially floated the idea of pursuing a PG-13 rating instead. Parker and Stone declined this suggestion, with what Matt Stone later described as something approaching joy. Speaking to Entertainment Weekly, Stone explained their intentions with a precision that only someone who has genuinely thought a project through can manage. They were, he said, spending Paramount's money to build a large and extended middle finger directed at the Motion Picture Association of America, the organization that assigns ratings to films. They wanted to offend the MPAA. That was an explicit goal. And they succeeded, with a thoroughness that must have been genuinely satisfying. When South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, was first submitted to the MPAA for rating consideration, it came back with an NC-17. This is the rating that effectively kills a film no major theater chains will carry an NC-17 film, no mainstream marketing campaign can be built around it, and the commercial prospects shrink to almost nothing. Parker and Stone revised the cut, submitted again. Another NC-17. They revised again. Another NC-17. Then another. Then another. 6 times, the film was submitted to the MPAA. 6 times, it came back with a rating that would have doomed its commercial release. On the 6th submission, after Parker and Stone had extracted a specific numerical threshold from the ratings board, apparently 400 swear words would guarantee an NC-17 inches perpetuity, the film finally received an R. The final cut contains 399 profanities. Not 400, not 398, exactly 399. They counted. They stopped one short of the line on purpose. The film holds a Guinness World Record, certified in 2001, for most swearing in an animated film. The record stands as of this writing. The song Uncle Fucka, which appears in the first act, uses the word in its title 31 times in roughly 3 minutes of screen time. This is efficient work. The film was a musical. A genuinely accomplished, Broadway-caliber musical with real songs and real theatrical construction. This was not a joke or a gimmick. Parker, who studied music at the University of Colorado, had serious compositional chops, and the songs in Bigger, Longer, and Uncut are legitimately good pieces of musical theater. The song Blame Canada was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song in 2000. Parker and Stone attended the Oscar ceremony. They had taken LSD before arriving. Stone wore a replica of the lavender Versace dress Jennifer Lopez had worn to the Grammy Awards. Parker wore a pink gown inspired by the dress Gwyneth Paltrow had worn when she won her Oscar the previous year. They walked the red carpet of the most prestigious evening in American cinema, tripping on acid, wearing ball gowns, representing a film about animated children who start a war over profanity. Nobody stopped them. Nobody turned them away. Because they had made one of the highest-grossing animated films of the year, and the Academy had no mechanism for excluding people who had earned their seats, regardless of what they were wearing or what they had ingested. The film's plot is, essentially, a dissertation on the hypocrisy of American censorship. A group of children sneak into an rated film and come back using language their parents have never heard before. The resulting moral panic, the need to find something to blame for the corruption of these children, escalates into the United States, declaring war on Canada. The film argues, with increasing explicitness as it proceeds, that American culture has its priorities exactly backwards. Violence is acceptable entertainment, but language is obscene, meaning the censors who rate films will pass extreme graphic violence while objecting to a word. The children in the film are allowed to watch bodies destroyed. They are not allowed to hear profanity. This argument is made, it must be noted, in a film that contains 399 pieces of profanity and 221 acts of violence. The medium is the message. The film proves its own point by being what it is. And then the MPAA itself proved the point. Paramount Pictures had originally wanted to call the film South Park, All Hell Breaks Loose. According to Parker and Stone, the MPAA objected to the use of the word hell in the title. The MPAA has disputed this account, but the counterproposal offered by Parker and Stone was South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, which is, if you read it with any awareness of its double meaning, a fairly explicit anatomical reference. The MPAA approved the double entendre title while objecting to the word hell, which is, to be honest, the most perfect illustration of exactly the argument the film is making that anyone could have arranged, and no one had to arrange it. It happened organically. MPAA President Jack Valenti later stated publicly that he regretted not giving the film an NC-17 rating. In response to the controversy generated by the film, the MPAA expanded its rating system in the year 2000 to include detailed content descriptions alongside the letter ratings, the violence, language, sexual content notations that now appear on every movie poster. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, directly caused a change in how the American film rating system communicates with parents. A construction paper cartoon about children swearing changed the formal infrastructure of American movie classification. The film grossed over $83 million worldwide. It held the record as the highest-grossing rated animated film of its time until Seth Rogen's Sausage Party in 2016. Roger Ebert gave the film 2.5 stars and admitted to feeling genuinely offended, a statement that, from Ebert, carried real weight because he was not easily offended. He wrote that the MPAA had a lot of explaining to do for letting the film through with an R rating. Ebert was essentially agreeing with Parker and Stone's argument, while also being bothered by the film that proved it, which is a genuinely interesting position to occupy, and one that the filmmakers probably found more gratifying than a straight positive review. There is also a footnote to the film's history that involves Saddam Hussein, which sounds like the setup to a joke, but is actually just what happened. In the film, Saddam Hussein is depicted as Satan's emotionally abusive boyfriend in hell. Years later, while the actual Saddam Hussein was on trial for crimes against humanity in 2006, Matt Stone reportedly joked in an interview that the United States military had been showing the film to the real Saddam as a form of psychological discomfort. Whether this was true, whether it was even remotely true, is not something anyone has ever confirmed. But the fact that the claim was plausible enough to circulate unchallenged for years tells you something about the specific and unusual cultural territory that South Park had carved out for itself. Section 5. The 6-Day Machine. How the production process became a controversy factory. Most television shows work on a schedule that allows for careful consideration, revision, testing, and refinement. A typical animated series operates on a production cycle of somewhere between 6 months and a full year for a single episode. Scripts go through multiple drafts, storyboards are reviewed, voices are recorded, reviewed, re-recorded. Animation is completed over weeks. The whole process is designed to catch problems before they reach the audience, to smooth out the rough edges, reconsider the potentially offensive jokes, consult with the standards and practices department about content that might need adjustment. South Park has operated on none of these assumptions since Season 4, which began airing in 2000. Since then, every episode has been written, voiced, animated, and delivered to Comedy Central within approximately 6 days. 6 days from nothing from Trey Parker sitting in the writer's room with a blank legal pad and a specific kind of exhausted panic behind his eyes to a finished 22-minute episode broadcasting to millions of viewers. The 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford and premiered on Comedy Central on October 9th of that year, captured this process with an intimacy that is difficult to describe without sounding like you're exaggerating. Parker pacing the writer's room at 2 in the morning, still without a workable idea for an episode that airs in 4 days. Voice recording sessions happening simultaneously with animation production because there is no time to do them sequentially. All-nighters that Parker describes not as 5 a.m. nights, but as 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. nights, meaning they work straight through the evening, through the small hours, past dawn, until mid-morning, and then the episode is transmitted to the East Coast just hours before it airs. The documentary was nominated for an Emmy Award in the Outstanding Nonfiction Special category. It is also viewed as a portrait of creative work under extreme pressure, one of the most fascinating things about South Park that isn't South Park itself. The 6-day production schedule is central to understanding the show's controversies in a way that rarely gets discussed directly. Because what the schedule creates is essentially a live news operation, wearing the costume of a scripted comedy show. When the NBA was in the middle of its China controversy in October of 2019, South Park was able to air an episode responding to it in the same week. When Steve Irwin died in September of 2006, the show was able to include him in an episode 8 weeks later. When the 2016 election produced its unexpected result overnight, Parker and Stone were rewriting their episode within hours of the polls closing. No other scripted show on television can do this. Late-night talk shows can, because they're built around monologues and sketches that can be written and performed same day. But a scripted show with animation, voice acting, and an episodic narrative, the typical lead time on that kind of production is measured in months. South Park does it in less than a week. The consequence of this speed is that South Park operates with the raw, unfiltered energy of an immediate reaction rather than a considered response. The jokes that get made are the ones that seem obviously right at 2 in the morning under deadline pressure, not the ones that survive a week of testing and refinement and consultation. Sometimes those 2 a.m. jokes are brilliant. Sometimes they're brilliant in the moment and clumsy in retrospect. Sometimes they land in a way that feels like a punch when the context around them shifts. Parker has spoken about this honestly. He has said that the driving anxiety in the writer's room is not, will this upset someone, but will this be funny? The fear of not being funny, he has explained, is bigger than the fear of being offensive. When you watch the 6 Days to Air documentary, you can see this operating in real time. The show's creative process is oriented entirely around the question of whether something works as comedy. The social and political consequences of the joke are considered, but they are considered as secondary factors, usually after the joke has already been locked in because the clock is running. This is why Parker and Stone are so rarely apologetic about individual controversies. When you produce 22 minutes of television every week from a standing start, you don't have time for extended regret about any single episode. You finish one, and you're already starting the next one. The entire creative philosophy is built around momentum. Keep writing, keep moving. Don't look back at what you made last week, because this week is already happening. Dwelling would be fatal to the production schedule. There is also something worth saying about what the 6-day schedule means for the relationship between the show and its moment in history. Because the schedule isn't just a production choice, it's an editorial one. It means that South Park is always responding to now, not to last month or last year. The show is time-stamped in a way that few cultural artifacts are. When you watch an episode from October 2019, you are watching a document of exactly what Trey Parker and Matt Stone were thinking about on a specific Wednesday in a specific week of a specific year. The production schedule preserves the contemporaneity of the show's concerns, like amber preserves a fly. This also means that South Park has a specific kind of vulnerability that more carefully produced shows don't have. A joke that seems perfectly calibrated on the day it's written can feel wildly misjudged by the time it airs, or, more commonly, can feel misjudged by retrospect, as the cultural context around it shifts in ways that Parker and Stone couldn't have anticipated from inside the writer's room on a Tuesday night with a deadline bearing down. The Steve Irwin situation, which we'll return to in more detail later, is a perfect example of this. The joke was probably constructed with a specific target, the concept of too soon humor, the idea that even the devil has a line he won't cross, and not with Irwin himself as the primary subject. But by the time it aired, only 8 weeks after a beloved figure's death, the nuance of the meta-commentary was overwhelmed by the emotional rawness of recent loss. The joke did something different than it was designed to do, and there was no mechanism in the production process to catch that before broadcast. Most controversies can be traced, at least in part, to this dynamic. Not malice, not carelessness, but the specific kind of miscalibration that happens when intelligent, talented people are working at a speed that doesn't allow for second guessing. The documentary also captures something about Parker and Stone as people that I find genuinely illuminating. There's a moment where Parker talks about the terror of the blank page every week, and he describes it not as a creative anxiety, but as something closer to existential dread. Starting from nothing, with a broadcast date that doesn't move, is a particular kind of pressure that most creative professionals don't experience in that form. And the way Parker describes it, the way he clearly feels it, suggests that the speed is not comfortable for him, not a natural state, but something he has learned to survive by converting it into momentum. This matters for understanding the controversies, because it means the show is not being made from a position of ease and comfort. It's being made from a position of genuine creative pressure, and the controversies that result are products of that pressure as much as they are products of intention. Parker and Stone are not sitting calmly in a room, deciding which groups to offend this week. They are running as fast as they can, and sometimes they run directly into something they didn't see coming. Section 6. Scientology and the Church that Fought Back. On the 16th of November, 2005, South Park aired an episode called Trapped in the Closet. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most technically accomplished and culturally consequential things the show has ever produced, and the fallout from it is one of the strangest, most layered stories in the show's history. In the episode, Stan Marsh takes a Scientology personality test. The test identifies him as having unusually high thetan levels. Church officials become convinced he is the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. Tom Cruise visits to pay his respects, gets told by Stan that his movies are just okay, and then locks himself in a bedroom closet. Other famous Scientologists, including John Travolta and R. Kelly, come to try to convince Tom Cruise to come out of the closet. The episode uses coming out of the closet as a structural metaphor that doesn't require further explanation. Meanwhile, the actual cosmological beliefs of Scientology, the story of Xenu, the galactic overlord, the volcanoes, the thetans, the complete arc of what the church teaches about the origins of human existence are presented in detail on screen, with a caption that reads, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The episode was written and directed by Parker, who was credited under the pseudonym John Smith. The IMDb rating for the episode is 9.1. It is widely considered one of the best things South Park has ever made. And it did something that no American television show had done before. It went after Scientology with specific, documented, factual information about what the church teaches, presented in a context that made those teachings available for public examination. Nobody had done this before. As Matt Stone explained later, everyone in Hollywood was afraid of Scientology. The church was known for being extraordinarily litigious, for responding to criticism not with public statements, but with lawyers. The chilling effect on criticism was real and documented. South Park, as has become something of a pattern, simply didn't care. The reaction was swift. The very next day, November 17th, a high-ranking Scientology executive wrote an internal memo to the church's leader about how to respond to the episode. This memo later became public after the executive left the church and became one of its most vocal critics. The machinery of institutional response had engaged within 24 hours. But the most significant consequence came not from the church directly, but from inside the show's own production family. On the 13th of March, 2006, a press release went out announcing that Isaac Hayes, who had voiced the beloved character Chef since the show's premiere in 1997, was leaving the show. In the press release, Hayes stated, "There is a place in this world for satire, but there is a time when satire ends, and intolerance and bigotry towards religious beliefs of others begins." Matt Stone's response was blunt. He said it was 100% about Scientology. He noted that Hayes had cashed checks from a show that had been mocking Christians, Muslims, Catholics, and essentially every other religious group for years without apparent objection. The standard Hayes was applying to Scientology, Stone argued, was one he hadn't applied to any other faith the show had satirized. But the story has a layer beneath this one, and it is the layer that makes the whole thing genuinely heartbreaking rather than merely contentious. In January of 2006, shortly after the Trapped in the Closet episode aired, but before the announcement of Hayes' departure, Isaac Hayes suffered a stroke. According to his son, Isaac Hayes III, the stroke left the elder Hayes unable to speak, unable to make decisions independently, unable to sign his own name on documents. He was, in his son's words, in no position to resign under his own volition. Hayes III has been specific and consistent about what he believes happened. At the time of his father's departure, everyone around Hayes, his assistants, his publicists, his management team were Scientologists. His father's incapacity created an opportunity. Someone within that circle made the decision to quit South Park on Hayes' behalf without his meaningful participation and issued the press release in his name. Matt Stone has confirmed, in multiple interviews, that this is what he and Parker believe happened. They had come to understand the full picture, Stone said, a bit later, and that was totally what happened. Isaac Hayes died on the 10th of August 2008 from a second stroke, having never fully recovered from the first. He was 65 years old. The real story of his departure from the show didn't become fully public until years after his death, when his son began speaking about it openly. Consider what was actually taken from Isaac Hayes. He had voiced Chef for 9 years. He loved the role by all accounts, loved the character, loved the connection with the show's audience. He would joke with fans who recognized his voice. He was, by his son's description, genuinely proud of being part of South Park. And someone else, using his name, removed all of that from him while he was too ill to object. Parker and Stone never got the chance to reconcile with Hayes before he died. They dedicated a season 12 episode, The China Problem, to his memory. Their response to his announced departure, before they fully understood what had happened, was the episode The Return of Chef, which depicted the character as having been brainwashed by a fictional cult called the Super Adventure Club, a transparently obvious stand-in for Scientology. The episode used old audio recordings of Hayes' voice, spliced together to create new dialogue, and ended with Chef dying in an extremely graphic sequence. It was, in retrospect, a misdirected response to a situation far more complicated than anyone knew at the time. Parker and Stone thought they were defending themselves against a colleague who had turned on them. They were actually, unknowingly, responding to a tragedy that hadn't yet been fully understood. There is also the matter of what happened to the episode itself. Trapped in the Closet was scheduled for a rebroadcast on the 15th of March, 2006. Comedy Central pulled it at the last minute, replacing it with a rerun of Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls from Season 2. The official explanation was that it was a tribute to Hayes following his departure announcement. Multiple media reports suggested a different explanation. Tom Cruise had allegedly threatened to refuse to do publicity for Mission Impossible 3, which was distributed by Paramount, which was owned by Viacom, which also owned Comedy Central. If Cruise withheld his promotional cooperation, Paramount stood to lose enormous marketing value for a major summer film. The cartoon lost to the blockbuster. Cruise's representatives denied that any threat had been made. The timing of the pullback happening simultaneously with Hayes' departure announcement, and just before Mission Impossible 3's promotional campaign was widely noted. Parker and Stone issued a statement through their lawyers. The statement was signed, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, servants of the Dark Lord Xenu. Section 7. Faith, Blood, and Backlash, the Catholic League's long year, 2005 and 2006, were, by any reasonable assessment, the most intense years of controversy in South Park's history, up to that point. The Scientology situation was unfolding in slow motion throughout this period, but running alongside it was a controversy of a completely different character, one that involved the Catholic Church, a bleeding statue, and an international dispute that reached the Prime Minister of New Zealand. The Season 9 finale, Bloody Mary, aired on the 7th of December, 2005. This date is worth noting. December 7th is the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a Catholic observance specifically related to the Virgin Mary. Whether the scheduling was deliberate or coincidental, it was combustive. The episode follows Randy Marsh's arrest for drunk driving. Randy attends Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and becomes convinced, in the classic South Park tradition of a character latching onto an idea with unreasonable intensity, that his alcoholism is a disease over which he has absolutely no personal agency. Meanwhile, a statue of the Virgin Mary in a nearby town begins bleeding from what is initially described as its rear. People flood to the statue, believing it to be a miracle. Randy goes, hoping for a divine cure. The Pope himself investigates the statue. He examines it and determines that the blood is coming not from the statue's rear, but from its vagina. Since women bleed from their vaginas as a routine biological function, this does not constitute a miracle. Randy, freed from the idea that he has a miraculous cure available, is told by his son Stan that his alcoholism doesn't require a disease label or a divine intervention. It requires personal discipline. The episode's actual argument, underneath the imagery, is about accountability and the dangers of using illness frameworks to avoid personal responsibility. This argument did not reach the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. What reached them was the image of the Virgin Mary bleeding from a statue, and they responded with the kind of focused institutional fury that only organizations with a specific mandate and a press relations department can produce. Bill Donahue, the Catholic League's president, demanded an apology. He demanded that the episode be permanently retired, not just not rebroadcast, but actively removed from existence, not made available on DVD or any other format, essentially erased. He demanded that Joseph Califano, a Viacom board member who is also a practicing Catholic, issue a personal statement of condemnation. Califano complied, calling the episode appalling and disgusting. When Comedy Central rebroadcast the entirety of Season 9 Inches, late December 2005, Bloody Mary was conspicuously absent from the marathon. The network had blinked. The controversy went international, with a speed that suggested the episode had struck something that resonated beyond any single country's particular cultural sensitivities. In New Zealand, leaders from the Catholic Bishops' Conference, the Council of Christians and Muslims, and other religious organizations lobbied the network CanWest to cancel a planned airing of the episode. CanWest refused, and in a move that was either principled or opportunistic or both, actually aired the episode earlier than originally planned, capitalizing on the media attention the controversy had generated. New Zealand's Prime Minister Helen Clark called the episode revolting, but explicitly defended the network's right to air it anyway. She was, in other words, personally offended and institutionally supportive of the thing that offended her, which is a position that requires genuine intellectual consistency to maintain. The episode attracted a record audience of over 300,000 viewers in New Zealand, when it aired approximately 6 times the normal South Park viewership in that country. Formal complaints to New Zealand's Broadcasting Standards Authority were ultimately dismissed. The ruling stated, in language that was itself fairly remarkable, that showing disrespect does not amount to the sort of vicious or vitriolic attack normally associated with the denigration standard. In Australia, the network SBS initially refused to air the episode at all. It eventually aired on SBS Viceland in 2016, 11 years after the original broadcast. A decade-plus gap between production and broadcast is an extraordinary thing for an episode of a series that prides itself on immediate cultural relevance. Russia banned the Bloody Mary episode. Multiple countries in the Middle East had been restricting various South Park content for years by this point. There is something worth saying about what the Catholic League's campaign against Bloody Mary reveals about how institutional religious responses to satire typically function. The strategy isn't to engage with the satirical argument in this case, the show's actual point about personal responsibility and alcoholism. The strategy is to focus on the most viscerally offensive image and build the entire case around that image, in the hope that the surrounding context gets lost in the noise. And it often works, which is its own kind of commentary. The Bloody Mary episode is primarily about addiction and accountability. It is remembered primarily for a bleeding statue. The show's point got buried under its own imagery, which is something Parker has addressed directly in interviews. The frustration of making a substantive argument and watching the surface-level shock content absorb all of the public attention. Parker revealed in a DVD commentary that the episode was personal. Randy's drunk driving arrest was based on something that had happened with his own father when Trey was 9 years old. The Bloody Mary episode wasn't purely conceptual provocation. It came from somewhere real, and what it came from had nothing to do with defiling the Virgin Mary. That context doesn't change what the episode depicts. But it changes what the episode means, and the Catholic League's campaign was entirely unconcerned with what the episode meant. Section 8, The Muhammad Saga Part 1. The episode Nobody Noticed. On the 4th of July, 2001, South Park aired an episode called Super Best Friends. It was the third episode of the show's 5th season. In it, the boys get mixed up with a David Blaine cult and a team of religious superhero figures. Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, Laozi, and Muhammad assemble to save the day. Muhammad is drawn. He appears on screen multiple times. He has the power to conjure fire. He is treated with the same irreverent but essentially benign energy that the show extends to every other religious figure in its universe. Nobody cared. No protests, no complaints, no death threats, no diplomatic incidents. The episode aired on a federal holiday, got modest ratings, and moved on. Muhammad was even included in the show's opening title sequence as part of a crowd of background characters. Nobody blinked. I keep coming back to this episode, to this moment, because of everything that follows. Because this completely uncontroversial July 4th episode about religious superheroes would become, 9 years later, the collateral damage of a controversy that hadn't happened yet. The episode would be retroactively banned, pulled from rotation, removed from streaming platforms, excluded from DVD releases, not because of anything it contained, but because of what the world had become between 2001 and 2010. 2 months after Super Best Friends aired, the 11th of September, 2001 happened. And then, in September of 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons depicting Muhammad as part of what the paper described as a contribution to an ongoing debate about self-censorship and freedom of the press in democratic societies. The response was not a debate. The response was global and, in parts of the world, violent. Riots broke out across multiple countries. Embassies were attacked and burned in Damascus, Beirut, Tehran, and elsewhere. Over 100 people died in protests and related violence. Multiple cartoonists received specific death threats and went into hiding. Governments fell into difficult diplomatic negotiations. The word blasphemy was being used in contexts that Western liberal democracies hadn't heard it used with such intensity in decades. The world had shifted in a specific and significant way. The question of whether depicting Muhammad visually constituted a form of provocation that could justify violent responses was no longer theoretical. It was being answered, violently, in the streets of multiple cities. South Park addressed this directly in 2006, with a 2-part episode from Season 10 called Cartoon Wars. These episodes aired on April 5th and the 12th of April 2006, less than a year after the Danish cartoon riots, while the diplomatic fallout was still actively ongoing. The premise of Cartoon Wars is precise. The animated show Family Guy plans to air an episode containing a visual depiction of Muhammad. Islamic extremist groups threaten violent retaliation if the episode broadcasts. The town of South Park falls into a panic. Cartman, who hates Family Guy for his own entirely selfish reasons that have nothing to do with religious sensitivity, allies himself with the effort to censor the episode, while Kyle argues for free speech and the right to air the content regardless of threatened consequences. The genius of the Cartoon Wars two-parter is operating on multiple levels simultaneously. It is a genuine commentary on censorship and the way fear can distort editorial decisions. It is a parody of Family Guy's writing style that is simultaneously savage and affectionate. It is a meta-commentary on South Park's own position in the debate, because South Park was, in 2006, itself operating under exactly the pressures the episode was satirizing. And then something happened that turned the fictional plot into an accidentally perfect documentary. In the second episode, there is a sequence where Family Guy actually airs the Muhammad image within the narrative. The world doesn't end. Nobody gets hurt. The action just continues. But when South Park's characters try to air their own version of the Muhammad image, something appears on screen instead of the image. A black screen. Text that reads, Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network. Comedy Central, watching the episode before broadcast, had refused to allow the image to be shown on their own channel. While the fictional network in the episode was being pressured to censor a cartoon depicting Muhammad, the real network was censoring the real cartoon depicting Muhammad. Fiction and reality had collapsed into exactly the same event. South Park was experiencing, in production, the exact scenario it was in the middle of satirizing, and the audience was watching both the satire and the censored version of it simultaneously. Parker and Stone were allowed to include the censorship screen, the black box, with the explanatory text, but not the actual image. They publicly noted the specific irony. They were permitted to show Jesus defecating on President Bush and the American flag, which Comedy Central allowed, but a benign, positive, neutral depiction of Muhammad handing someone a football helmet, which was the actual planned scene, was forbidden. The double standard was stated plainly. Comedy Central, to their credit, did not pretend they were acting out of religious respect. They told Parker and Stone directly that they were afraid of getting blown up. This is an honest statement. It is also, in the context of a show being made about fear-distorting editorial decisions, a statement that demonstrated exactly what the show was arguing about. Parker and Stone were frustrated in ways that went beyond the usual creative friction with the network. They had tried to make a point about the corrosive effect of allowing violent threats to determine the content of free expression, and the network had proven the point by yielding to exactly that dynamic. The show had been right about something in the most uncomfortable possible way, not through clever prediction, but by having the argument confirmed in real time by the very people it was criticizing. In the years immediately following Cartoon Wars, South Park existed in a kind of editorial limbo regarding Muhammad. The 2001 Super Best Friends episode remained in circulation, at least for a while, because it had aired without incident before the cultural context shifted. But the Cartoon Wars episodes had established that Comedy Central was unwilling to show new depictions, and that constraint shaped the show's ability to engage with a subject it considered critically important to the ongoing conversation about free speech and cultural self-censorship. The full reckoning with this situation would come 4 years later, in 2010, in a pair of episodes that would become the most dangerous controversy the show had ever generated. Section 9, The Muhammad Saga, Part 2, Death Threats, and the Censored Speech About Censorship. The 200th episode of South Park aired on the 14th of April, 2010. Parker and Stone had decided to mark the milestone with something ambitious, a greatest hits of everything the show had ever done that had made someone angry, assembled into a single episode. Every celebrity the show had ever satirized was invited back to file a class-action lawsuit against the town of South Park. Tom Cruise assembles the aggrieved parties. The celebrity plaintiff's leverage is this: they'll drop the lawsuit if the town produces Muhammad for them. Muhammad, apparently, has a superpower that all the other celebrities want the ability to never be ridiculed. If they can transfer this power to themselves, no one will ever be able to mock them again. It is a beautiful piece of satirical construction. Muhammad is the one figure in contemporary culture who exists in a genuine zone of irridiculability, not because his dignity is above reproach, but because the threat of violent response has created a practical impossibility. The celebrities in the episode want that protection not out of any religious reverence, but because they're sick of being made fun of. The episode is examining, with unusual directness, the mechanism by which violent threat creates a real-world hierarchy of who can and can't be satirized. Muhammad appears in the episode, but always obscured, behind a black censored bar, inside a U-Haul truck, wearing a bear costume. South Park was pushing right up to the limit, acknowledging the subject, centering the episode on it, working the problem without crossing the explicit visual threshold that Comedy Central had drawn in 2006. The episode was brilliant. It was also received, in some quarters, as exactly the kind of provocation that certain organizations had been waiting for. Within days of episode 200 airing, a website called revolutionmuslim.com, run by a New York-based Islamist organization, posted a warning about Parker and Stone. The post included a photograph of Theo van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker who had been stabbed and shot to death in Amsterdam in 2004 after making a short film about the treatment of women in Islam. The post included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices in both New York and Los Angeles. The author, a man named Zachary Chesser, who used the online alias Abu Talha al-Amriki, wrote, "We have to warn Matt and Trey that what they are doing is stupid, and they will probably wind up like Theo van Gogh for airing this show. This is not a threat, but a warning of the reality of what will likely happen to them." The New York City Police Department increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters. The FBI opened an investigation on April 19th. What had been, for the previous 13 years, a contest of outraged letters and boycott campaigns and PTC press releases had moved into a different register entirely. Episode 201, the follow-up, aired on the 21st of April 2010, but it didn't air in the form Parker and Stone had created. Without consulting the show's creators, Comedy Central inserted audio bleeps over every single mention of Muhammad's name throughout the episode, not just in sensitive contexts, but every single mention, in any context. They censored multiple passages of dialogue. And then they censored the episode's climactic scene, Kyle's final speech, which was the episode's moral statement, the payoff that the entire two-episode arc had been building toward. Kyle's speech was about how using violence and threats to suppress free expression was wrong, that yielding to threats made those threats more effective and more likely to be repeated. It was a speech about exactly what was happening to the episode in which it appeared. Comedy Central censored a speech about censorship, and in doing so, they simultaneously proved the speech's argument and silenced the argument. South Park Studios issued a formal statement. The network had inserted numerous additional bleeps without the creators' permission. Parker and Stone were not consulted. What aired was not what they had made. The uncensored version of the episode was never meant to be publicly accessible, but a partially uncensored version was discovered on Comedy Central's own web servers by a user of the website 4chan and distributed across the internet, where it spread in the way things spread when they're supposed to be hidden. The response from public figures was remarkable in its unity of direction, if not its unity of tone. Jon Stewart dedicated 10 minutes of The Daily Show to the situation, directing his commentary specifically at Revolution Muslim and expressing his feelings about the threat with language that is not suitable for this particular narration. Bill Maher discussed the importance of the First Amendment. Senator Joe Lieberman publicly criticized the organization. Zachary Chesser was arrested in July of 2010. He was not primarily arrested for the South Park threats, though those were part of the pattern. He was arrested for attempting to travel to Somalia to join Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization, and for providing material support to the group. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Another member of the Revolution Muslim organization, Jesse Curtis Morton, was arrested and sentenced to 11.5 years. The South Park controversy wasn't the reason these men were imprisoned. It was part of a larger pattern of behavior that had drawn law enforcement attention, and the arrests happened for reasons that went considerably beyond a cartoon show. But the line connecting their online activity to their subsequent radicalization was real, and it was part of the eventual case. In the days following the threat post, Revolution Muslim had also published what appeared to be personal information about Parker and Stone's residences, along with the location information about Comedy Central's offices. Parker later said, in several interviews, that the period was genuinely frightening, not in the abstract cultural sense that controversies usually are, but in the concrete physical, this could actually hurt us since. For a few weeks in April and May of 2010, the two most successful comedy writers in America were living with security details because they had put a fictional religious figure inside a fictional bear costume. Parker and Stone went back to work. They kept making the show. They continued pushing on exactly the subjects that had generated the threats, not in a spirit of recklessness, but in a spirit of refusal. A refusal to let the threat of violence determine what subjects they were permitted to approach. This is not a comfortable position, and the fact that they maintained it says something about their actual convictions that goes beyond whatever performance of bravado public figures sometimes affect. The aftermath had lasting archival effects. Episodes 200, 201, and Super Best Friends were all removed from Comedy Central's website, from streaming platforms, and from syndication. They were excluded from DVD releases, in some cases from DVD box sets, whose packaging claimed all episodes of the season were included. The 2001 Super Best Friends episode, which had aired in a world that didn't yet have the context that would later make it controversial, was retroactively designated as unavailable. Not because it had done anything wrong, but because the world around it had changed. The episode itself hadn't changed. Its meaning had been revised by history. There is something genuinely unusual about this kind of retroactive controversy about content that was unproblematic in the moment of its creation becoming dangerous through no action of its own, through the shift of external circumstances. Super Best Friends depicted Muhammad as a superhero, fighting alongside Jesus and Buddha and Moses to protect innocent people. That was fine in 2001. By 2010, the same frames were legally inaccessible. The episode hadn't moved. The world had moved around it. The Tim Square car bomb attempt on May 1st, 2010, 10 days after episode 201 aired, generated its own brief controversy, when a sitting congressman publicly speculated about whether the South Park situation might have been a motivating factor. Revolution Muslim denied any connection, and the eventual suspect, Faisal Shahzad, had been planning his attack for months before the South Park controversy developed. The speculation was unfounded, but the fact that a congressman thought it worth speculating about publicly illustrates how far the cultural temperature had risen around this specific set of events. To this day, the two most ambitious episodes South Park ever produced, the ones that most directly grappled with the show's own central argument about freedom of expression, are legally unavailable through any official channel. The most powerful statement South Park ever made about the right to say things that powerful people want suppressed is the statement that got suppressed. Section 10. The China Incident, when a construction paper cartoon challenged a superpower. On the 2nd of October 2019, South Park aired the 299th episode of its run, titled Banned in China. It aired during the exact same week that the NBA was in the middle of the most significant diplomatic crisis in professional basketball's international history. Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey had tweeted a single tweet, 7 words expressing support for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protesters. The response from China was immediate and severe. Chinese broadcasters pulled Rockets games. Chinese sponsors severed ties. The NBA, which had spent years carefully cultivating the Chinese market and generating enormous revenue from Chinese fans and Chinese corporate partnerships, found itself in the position of having to choose between standing behind an employee's political expression and protecting a financial relationship worth billions of dollars. The NBA chose the money. The league issued statements that were widely criticized in the United States as craven and insufficient. James Harden, the Rockets star player, flew to China and publicly apologized. The organization spent the next several weeks in visible discomfort, issuing clarifications and qualifications while its most prominent voices tried to thread the needle between American values and Chinese commercial requirements. Into this specific cultural moment, South Park dropped Banned in China. The episode has 2 parallel storylines. In the first, Randy Marsh travels to China to expand his Tegrity Farms marijuana business, certain that the Chinese market represents untapped commercial potential. He is promptly arrested, sentenced to a labor camp, and spends much of the episode working alongside This Is Real, Winnie the Pooh, who has been imprisoned because internet memes comparing Chinese President Xi Jinping to the character have made the original Winnie the Pooh image effectively banned in China. Mickey Mouse also appears in the labor camp, a reference to Disney's ongoing commercial relationship with China and the various editorial adjustments Disney had been making to its content to maintain access to the Chinese market. In the second storyline, Stan and his friends form a band. A Hollywood producer approaches them with the offer of a biopic deal. But every time they write a version of their story that feels true to them, the Chinese censors reviewing the script demand changes. References to the Dalai Lama must be removed. References to organ transplantation must be removed. Any suggestion of homosexuality must be removed. Any positive portrayal of Taiwan, any reference to Tiananmen Square. The producer explains, with increasing frankness, that to make money in China, you have to be willing to erase yourself. Stan eventually gives up entirely, unable to write a version of his own story that doesn't require him to stop being who he is. The episode contains a line that became one of the most quoted things South Park has ever produced. A character explaining to Stan that you've got to lower your ideals of freedom if you want to suck on the warm teat of China. Within days of the episode airing, South Park was erased from the Chinese internet. Not removed, not restricted, not age-gated erased. A search on Weibo, China's version of Twitter, returned 0 results for the show among billions of past posts. Episodes and seasons that had been available on Youku, the streaming platform owned by Alibaba, disappeared. Fan pages and discussion forums returned error messages, citing relevant laws and regulations. The show that had spent 22 years pissing off everyone it could find had achieved a kind of censorship so complete that it was almost impressive. Parker and Stone's response was issued through the show's official social media channels. It read, in its entirety, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy. She doesn't look like Winnie the Pooh at all. Tune in to our 300th episode this Wednesday at 10. Long live the great Communist Party of China. May the autumn sorghum harvest be bountiful. We good now, China." This statement is, start to finish, a masterclass in controlled contempt delivered through the medium of performative subservience. It invokes the NBA situation explicitly, positioning their refusal to apologize in direct contrast to the league's public humiliations. It parodies the kind of corporate crawl that American companies were routinely performing for Chinese market access. It taunts the Chinese government with a reference to the Xi Jinping, Winnie the Pooh comparison they had tried to suppress. It ends with a question, "We good now, China?" that is both a sarcastic dismissal and a genuine statement of indifference. The response went viral globally. Ted Cruz tweeted at the NBA, using South Park as the example of how to handle Chinese censorship pressure. Bloomberg News reported that Apple, which had significant manufacturing in China and a substantial portion of its global user base in Chinese markets, was unlikely to bid for South Park's streaming rights precisely because of the China ban, a development that meant the show's political choices were having measurable effects on its business prospects. Parker and Stone clearly did not adjust their approach in response to this information. The Banned in China episode has since become, in retrospect, one of the most significant pieces of political commentary that South Park has produced. Not because it changed Chinese censorship policy, which it obviously did not, and not because it changed American corporate behavior in China, which it mostly did not, but because it changed the public conversation about the subject in ways that were both immediate and lasting. Before Banned in China, the systematic self-censorship that American entertainment companies and sports leagues were practicing in their relationships with the Chinese government was happening largely in the background, known to industry insiders and trade journalists, but not a subject of mainstream public conversation. The Hollywood studios editing their films for Chinese release, removing references to Taiwan and Tibet and other politically sensitive subjects, were doing so quietly. The NBA's capitulation to Chinese pressure had cracked that open, but South Park's episode and its subsequent banning, and the mock apology, and the media coverage of all of it pushed the conversation into the mainstream in a way that nothing had done before. After Banned in China, politicians started asking questions publicly about corporate complicity with Chinese censorship. Journalists started writing about the specific editorial changes that Hollywood was making. The quiet accommodation became a public debate. South Park didn't start the conversation, but it gave the conversation a specificity and a cultural velocity that it had been lacking. What a construction paper cartoon managed to do, in 22 minutes, that years of think tank reports and editorial columns and congressional testimony had not managed to do. Section 11. The Trump Era and the White House fires back. For most of its run, South Park had maintained what Parker and Stone described as a position of equal opportunity skepticism, suspicious of everybody in power, contemptuous of both major political parties, uninterested in taking sides in a landscape where every side seemed equally populated by people who took themselves too seriously. The term South Park Republican entered the cultural lexicon in the early 2000s, coined to describe people who were fiscally conservative, socially libertarian, and united principally by their distaste for political correctness in either of its ideological forms. Parker and Stone consistently rejected the label. Stone once told a reporter that he hated conservatives, but really hated liberals. Parker told Rolling Stone that he had never voted in his life. This position, genuine disgust with power across the political spectrum, a refusal to be drafted by either team, is one of the more coherent political philosophies a satire show can maintain. When you mock environmentalism with the same energy you mock religious fundamentalism, you're harder to co-opt. Neither side can fully claim you. Both sides are perpetually annoyed by you. This is, honestly, a pretty good place to be if your goal is to make fun of as many people as possible. But the political landscape shifted underneath this position in ways that made it increasingly difficult to maintain with the same neutrality it had once conveyed. The polarization of American political life in the 2010s meant that equal mockery of both sides began to function differently than it had in the early 2000s. When one side is arguing that climate change is real and requires policy responses, and the other is arguing that climate change is a hoax, mocking both sides with equal vigor is not actually a neutral act. It is a statement that both positions are equally absurd, which they are not. South Park's Man-Bear-Pig storyline, in which Al Gore is depicted as a delusional fool, obsessing over a non-existent threat, spent 12 years communicating exactly this false equivalence to an enormous audience. To Parker and Stone's considerable credit, they eventually acknowledged this directly. 12 years after Man-Bear-Pig, in 2018, they returned to the subject in 2 episodes called Time to Get Cereal and Nobody Got Cereal. Man-Bear-Pig returns. He is real. He is devastating. The boys apologize to Al Gore for not believing him. Gore, characteristically, accepts the apology in the most annoying way possible, which is consistent with how the show treats everyone. But the apology happens. The course correction is made, on air, in character, explicitly. How many other political comedy shows have ever issued an on-screen correction of a previously stated political position? Not rhetorical revision, not quietly dropping the subject, but an actual in-narrative admission that they were wrong about something? South Park did this with climate change, which was one of the more consequential wrong things any popular entertainment property has said in the last 20 years. The Trump era created new and specific complications for the show's political positioning. Parker and Stone had spent years using the existing character of Mr. Garrison the boys' teacher as a stand-in for Trump, rather than creating a direct Trump character. They were explicit about why. Trump was already so performatively absurd, so naturally satirical in his own behavior, that creating a parody of him felt redundant. Stone, in interviews, said that Trump was essentially already South Park. The show couldn't satirize him more effectively than he was satirizing himself. Season 20, which aired during the fall of 2016, built a storyline around the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win the presidential election. Parker and Stone had structured their narrative around that assumption. When Trump won on November 8th, they had to rewrite the episode scheduled to air the following night from scratch. The resulting episode, titled "Oh Geez," was not their best work. They knew it. Parker said so publicly. The 6-day production schedule, which had always been a creative asset, became a liability when the entire premise of a season-long narrative was suddenly, overnight, wrong. The decision to eventually depict Trump directly, rather than through the Garrison surrogate, came gradually, and with full awareness that it meant abandoning a certain kind of equal distance positioning. Parker explained this in an interview with the New York Times that I find genuinely illuminating. He said they had always believed that political correctness was the primary threat to comedy and free expression, the main thing that was trying to close down the conversation and police what could and couldn't be said. But Trump showed them something else, a political movement that didn't just reject political correctness, but rejected the concept of shared reality. And for satirists who depend on a shared understanding of what's actually true in order to demonstrate what's absurd, a movement that creates its own reality is an existential threat of a different kind entirely. You can't satirize something effectively if there's no agreed-upon baseline of truth to satirize against. Season 27 premiered on the 23rd of July, 2025, just hours after Parker and Stone signed a new 5-year deal with Paramount, worth a reported $1.5 billion, covering 50 new episodes and bringing the show's entire library to Paramount Plus for the first time. The episode, titled Sermon on the Mount, depicted Trump directly for the first time in the show's history. No Garrison proxy, no plausible deniability. Trump appears in the Oval Office, arguing with the Canadian Prime Minister about tariffs. Trump appears in bed with Satan, insinuating a desire for sexual contact while Satan rejects him, noting that Trump's claimed hard work has consisted entirely of memes and just fucking around. A deepfake-assisted public service announcement depicts a live-action rendering of a naked Trump wandering through the desert. The episode also addressed the Paramount-Trump legal settlement directly. Jesus appears at South Park Elementary and explains that he's there because Paramount made a deal with Trump, and he's contractually obligated to be present. The show was commenting on its own corporate parents' capitulation to legal pressure from the President of the United States in an episode that its star Bowers flew corporate parent. The audacity of this move, biting the hand that had just written you a check for $1.5 billion, in an episode that aired the same day you cashed, that check is genuinely difficult to comprehend as anything other than a statement of principle. Within 24 hours, the White House issued a formal response. Spokesperson Taylor Rogers stated, "This show hasn't been relevant for over 20 years and is hanging on by a thread with uninspired ideas in a desperate attempt for attention." The statement called the show fourth-rate and said the left had no authentic or original content. Let me sit with this for a moment, because I think it needs sitting with. The most powerful governmental office on Earth, the institution that commands the world's largest military, that directs the world's largest economy, that holds the permanent membership on the United Nations Security Council, took time out of its official communications to issue a formal press release about a cartoon show. A cartoon made of construction paper. The actual White House, with its actual spokespersons and its actual press apparatus, sent an official statement to the actual media of record to say that a cartoon was not relevant. If you are looking for a definition of relevance, you have found it. When a government feels the need to officially declare that something does not matter, that thing matters enormously. The denial is itself the evidence. Parker's response at San Diego Comic-Con the following day, July 24th, is the most efficient piece of political commentary he has ever delivered. When asked about the White House's response, he looked at the camera and said, "We're terribly sorry." And then he held a deadpan stare for approximately 5 seconds. That's the whole response. No elaboration, no defense, no escalation. Just an expression of regret that is, obviously, not an expression of regret at all. The Season 27 premiere drew 5.9 million viewers across Comedy Central and Paramount Plus in its first 3 days. It was the biggest linear season premiere for South Park since 1999, the show's biggest cable audience share for a season premiere in 26 years. Not bad for a show that the White House had called irrelevant and hanging by a thread. Season 27's second episode, Got a Nut, drew similar numbers and targeted J.D. Vance and Kristi Noem. Vance responded on social media with the words, "Well, I've finally made it," which is either a person comfortable enough with themselves to laugh at a cartoon, or a person savvy enough to know that complaining would make them look worse, or both. Subsequent episodes in Season 27 and Season 28 continued the focus on the Trump administration, Satan as Trump's prisoner in the White House, a Kristi Noem character going on a puppy-killing rampage as a reference to her memoir's admission that she had killed her own dog, the full apparatus of satirical machinery deployed against targets that Parker himself characterized not as a political shift, but as a response to the fact that politics became pop culture. That phrase, politics became pop culture, is the key to understanding the current era. South Park's explicit brief has always been to satirize pop culture, the shared cultural territory that everyone occupies regardless of their specific political affiliations. For most of the show's history, politics was one part of that territory, cycling through the rotation alongside celebrity gossip and social trends and sports and entertainment. But somewhere around 2015 and 2016, politics stopped being one component of popular culture and became its entire substrate. There was no apolitical conversation anymore. Everything was politics. And a show that drew its material from the world as it actually was couldn't pretend otherwise without becoming dishonest about the world it was observing. The show had not become partisan. It had become accurate. Section 12. Legacies, lasting marks, and the continuing work of saying the thing. There are exactly 6 South Park episodes that have been genuinely banned or pulled from circulation. 6 out of 338 that have aired. That is less than 2% of the show's total output. And of those 6, 5 were pulled not because of public complaints or advertiser pressure or PTC campaigns, but because of threats of physical violence. The show that the Parents Television Council has been trying to cancel since 1997 has, from the perspective of actual forced removal, barely been scratched. The surface-level apparatus of conservative moral outrage, the angry emails, the boycott campaigns, the formal complaints to broadcasting authorities, has accomplished essentially nothing. The show has shrugged it all off, season after season, in the way that rivers shrug off rain. What has actually affected the show's archive is different. It's been government censorship, backed by the implicit threat of violence, that pulled the Muhammad episodes. It's been the calculated decisions of a corporate parent protecting its financial interests that pulled Trapped in the Closet. The forces that have actually changed what people can access haven't been moral outrage. They've been power. This is itself one of the show's persistent arguments, made over 28 years with varying degrees of explicitness. The thing that actually suppresses free expression is not the disapproval of decent people with genuine objections. It's the combination of institutional power and the threat of serious consequences. The PTC has been objecting to South Park since 1997, and the show is worth $5 billion. Comedy Central has censored or pulled episodes a handful of times, always in response to something that had financial or physical consequences attached to it. The moral objections, on their own, have not moved the needle. If that's a cynical observation, it's also an accurate one. And accuracy is, ultimately, what South Park has always been most committed to. Accuracy about human motivation, about institutional behavior, about the gap between what people say they believe and what they actually do when faced with consequences. The show has been wrong about things. The man-bear-pig situation is the clearest example, where a sustained satirical attack on climate change concern spent 12 years communicating something that was not true. Parker and Stone fixed it, publicly, in character, with an apology from the boys to Al Gore. But the 12 years of the wrong version still happened. They still reached millions of people. The correction was necessary, and it was admirable, but it couldn't undo what had been communicated before it. There are other things the show has gotten wrong, or that have aged badly, in ways the original episodes couldn't have anticipated. The accumulated weight of racial and ethnic humor across 28 seasons is the most frequently cited example. Not any single joke, but the pattern, the choices about what to depict and how and to what end across nearly 3 decades. The show has always defended itself on the grounds of equal opportunity offense, and the defense is partially valid. No group has been exempted. But critics who point out that equal offense in an unequal society is not actually neutral are also right. The argument doesn't have a clean resolution, and it doesn't need one. It needs to be held, acknowledged, and thought about, which is not the same as resolving it. The show's track record on specific social questions is actually more mixed than the controversy narrative suggests. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride was a genuinely compassionate portrayal of a gay character in 1997, when most American television was still treating homosexuality as either invisible or comedically deviant. Best Friends Forever, which won an Emmy in 2005, engaged with the Terry Schiavo Right to Die case with more nuance and honesty than most of the actual commentary the case generated. The With Apologies to Jesse Jackson episode, which used a racial slur 43 times and was praised by the NAACP for its context and its argument, stands as one of the more unusual pieces of commentary on language and power that American television has produced. The show that everyone expects to be reflexively offensive is, in specific episodes and on specific subjects, thoughtful in ways that the discourse around it never quite captures. The economic model of South Park is worth understanding as a structural condition, not just a business fact. The show has always been cheap to make relative to its cultural impact. The animation style, sophisticated under the hood but deliberately crude in appearance, doesn't require the enormous budgets of a Pixar production or even a traditional hand-drawn animated series. Parker and Stone voice most of the characters themselves. The writing staff is small. The 6-day production cycle eliminates the expensive development periods that other shows require. The margins on South Park are extraordinary, which means the show can absorb controversies that would be commercially fatal to a more conventionally produced property. Losing a sponsor, losing a market, losing a distribution deal, these consequences don't threaten the show's existence in the way they would threaten a show with higher overhead and lower margins. This economic resilience is, in a real sense, what has enabled the creative bravery. Parker and Stone can afford to be controversial because being controversial doesn't destroy the business case for the show. The worst outcomes an episode pulled, a country banning them, a corporate parent briefly unhappy, are annoying but survivable. The willingness to push isn't separate from the economic structure that protects the pushing. They reinforce each other. The question of what the show's legacy will ultimately be is genuinely open, and it's one I've spent considerable time with in the course of putting this together. When South Park eventually ends, and it will end, Parker and Stone won't do this forever. What will people remember? The fart jokes, certainly. The April Fool's prank that made the nation's most invested cable audience briefly furious. Cartman feeding Scott to Norman his own parents in a bowl of chili, and the specific cold premeditation of it. Isaac Hayes, and the sadder truth beneath the surface story of his departure. Episodes 200 and 201, and the speech about censorship that got censored, and the man who made the threats, who went to prison for 25 years, and the episodes that are still technically unavailable through official channels. The Chinese internet, scrubbed clean of an animated show's name in a single weekend, a White House press release about construction paper. But I suspect what will last longest, longer than any individual episode or scandal, is something harder to articulate. South Park spent 28 seasons and counting, demonstrating that comedy is a form of honesty, that the satirist's job is to say, accurately and without flinching, what the institutions and the powerful and the comfortable would prefer not to have said. That this job requires the willingness to be wrong sometimes, and to be corrected sometimes, and to keep going anyway. That the alternative, the carefully calibrated comedy that offends no one, that passes through the cultural filter without friction, that the algorithm loves and the corporations can comfortably attach their logos to, is not actually comedy at all, because it has been emptied of the only thing that makes comedy worth having, the truth. South Park has been wrong about things. It has caused real pain to specific people. It has sometimes aimed at targets that didn't deserve what they got, and missed targets that deserved more. It has been reckless with the speed of its production, and defensive in ways that weren't always warranted, and it has made jokes that aged into ugliness in ways that are uncomfortable to revisit. And it has also produced, over 28 seasons, a body of work that constitutes one of the most sustained acts of satirical honesty in the history of American popular culture. Not consistently honest, not always right, but consistently committed to the proposition that nothing is exempt from examination, that fear should not determine what can be said, and that the moment you decide certain subjects are beyond your reach, you have given something up that is very difficult to get back. Matt Stone said it in an interview years ago, in response to criticism that South Park was too offensive. You can't do satire if there are certain things you're not allowed to make fun of. That's the whole argument, in one sentence. Everything else is elaboration. The construction paper kids are still in their small Colorado town. The show is still making the jokes that make some people furious and other people feel seen. The White House has issued its formal statement. Trey Parker has delivered his deadpan stare. The ratings are the best they've been in years. The deal is signed. The episodes are being written right now. somewhere in a writer's room where the terror of the blank page is still the most powerful thing in the building. The controversies haven't slowed down. If anything, they've gotten bigger. And the show has gotten more watched, more discussed, more financially secure, more culturally central with each passing year of alleged irrelevance. I started researching this particular piece, expecting to find a list of offensive moments. What I found instead was something closer to a map of where American anxiety has lived, year by year, across nearly 3 decades. South Park's controversies are a timeline of what the culture was afraid of, what it was ashamed of, what it was trying not to look at directly. The show didn't create those anxieties. It just had the audacity, and the staying power, and the economic resilience, and the creative discipline to keep pointing at them season after season, in the voice of 4 construction paper children from a small mountain town that doesn't actually exist. There's something in that worth staying awake for, or worth falling asleep to, slowly, as the words settle around you, and the scandals, and the controversies, and the death threats, and the mock apologies drift through the air like snow in a Colorado winter, quiet and cold, and genuinely quite funny. If you're in the right frame of mind, that's everything, all of it, from the first construction paper short to the current season, laid out as carefully and honestly as I can manage. If this kept you company tonight, whether you made it all the way through or drifted off somewhere around the Scientology section, I hope it was worth your time. If you'd consider subscribing and leaving a comment about which of these stories you found most surprising or most compelling, that genuinely helps more than you might expect. Every comment, every subscribe, every share keeps this kind of long-form work possible. Rest well. And the next time someone tells you that South Park hasn't been relevant for years, just remember, the White House said that too. Good night. End of script. Section 13. The smaller scandals that shaped the show, a season-by-season tour through the archive. The major controversies get all the attention. The Muhammad episodes, the Scientology situation, the China ban, these are the ones that show up in retrospective lists and documentary segments and university media studies curricula. But the show's history is dense, with smaller controversies, season-by-season provocations that didn't generate international incidents or congressional statements, but that shaped the show's relationship with its audience and with American culture in ways that are equally worth understanding. Season 1 established several templates that would run for the next 27 years. The Mr. Hanky the Christmas Pooh episode, which aired in December 1997, was the show's first Christmas episode and introduced a character so inherently absurd, a talking piece of feces with holiday magic, that describing it adequately to someone who hasn't seen it is essentially impossible. The episode was also, underneath the obvious shock imagery, a Christmas story about being an outsider. Kyle, who is Jewish, is the only one who can see Mr. Hanky because he doesn't celebrate Christmas, and the town's refusal to believe him reflects the experience of being the kid whose holiday is not the one being celebrated. The character became a recurring South Park figure for years. The Parents Television Council found the episode deeply offensive. The episode found the humanity in its premise. The Season 1 episode, featuring Tom Hanks, or rather, a Tom Hanks action figure being used to represent a sexual encounter, was remarkable for its time in American animation and would have been remarkable in many international contexts. That the episode aired at all, without legal challenge or broadcast restriction, says something about the specific protections that fictional, satirical content enjoys in American media law. Season 2 brought the formal introduction of Starvin' Marvin, which generated immediate controversy for its depiction of Ethiopian children, in ways that many critics found racially exploitative rather than satirically illuminating. Parker and Stone maintained that the episode was targeting American charity industry dynamics rather than Ethiopians themselves. And the episode includes critique of Sally Struthers that has a specific comedic target. The controversy about whether the execution matched the intention followed the episode for years. The Season 3 episode Chin Pokemon, which aired in 1999 and satirized the Pokemon craze alongside broader commentary about Japanese cultural exports and American susceptibility to Japanese consumer products, generated controversy in Japan specifically, where the episode was received less negatively than American critics expected. Apparently, because Japanese audiences recognized the critique as being directed primarily at American consumer culture. This is a pattern that would repeat. Episodes that seemed likely to offend a specific national or cultural group sometimes resonated differently with that group than the offense prediction model suggested. The Season 4 episode Cartman Joins NAMBLA deserves mention because its title alone, which is the name of a real organization that has been widely associated with the sexualization of children, generated significant, pre-broadcast controversy that turned out to be somewhat displaced. The episode's content is a trap set for Cartman by its own premise. Cartman, thinking he is finding a club of mature men who will appreciate his sophistication, connects with actual members of the actual organization, and the episode proceeds from there, in ways that foreground the horror, rather than normalizing it. The episode was more responsible in its execution than its title suggested, which was itself a statement about how much a title can determine public perception independently of content. The Season 5 episode, Scott Tenorman Must Die, which aired on the 11th of July, 2001, occupies a unique place in the show's history. Not primarily because of public controversy, there was relatively little formal institutional objection to it, but because of what it did to the show's internal mythology. The episode's finale, in which Cartman arranges for an older student's parents to be killed by a farmer, and then has their bodies ground into chili, which he serves to the boy, represents a categorical escalation in what Cartman was understood to be capable of. Before this episode, Cartman was cruel and manipulative, and bigoted in ways that were extreme for an animated character, but legible as a specific kind of comedic exaggeration. After it, he was something else, a character who was capable of engineering genuine murder and who found satisfaction in watching a child consume the remains of his own parents. The premeditation of it is what strikes viewers most. This wasn't an impulsive act or an accident with bad consequences. It was an orchestrated plan, executed with patience and precision, culminating in a moment of genuine horror that the episode presents without mitigating comedy. The controversy this episode generated was quieter than most South Park controversies. No boycotts, no PTC campaigns, no congressional statements, but it was in some ways deeper. It raised a question about what kind of show South Park wanted to be, and by extension, what kind of relationship it wanted to have with the audience. You can laugh at Cartman's schemes when they're cruel but bounded. The chili episode crosses a line into something that requires the audience to examine what exactly they're laughing at and why, and whether the laughter is comfortable or a sign that something in the comedy has gone wrong. Parker and Stone have always maintained that the episode represents a creative breakthrough, that Scott Tenorman Must Die is the episode that showed them what South Park could be at its most ambitious. They point to it as the moment where the show stopped being a show about children doing shocking things and became a show about the moral complexity that the character's extremity made possible. Cartman, as a genuine psychopath, treated as such by the narrative, opens up storytelling possibilities that Cartman, as an extreme but essentially comedic bully, does not. The Season 6 episode Jared Has AIDS, which aired on the 6th of March 2002, provides one of the more extraordinary examples of South Park's tendency toward retroactive controversy episodes that were innocuous at broadcast and became disturbing later when real-world events recontextualized them. The episode centered on Jared Fogle, then known exclusively as the Subway sandwich spokesman who had lost a significant amount of weight through a diet of Subway sandwiches. In the South Park version, Jared claims that he lost weight because he got AIDS, a running joke about the pronunciation of the abbreviation for personal trainers and dietitians. There is a recurring gag about Jared giving AIDS to children, played purely as a wordplay situation. This was, in 2002, a pun. A moderately crude pun about a corporate mascot, nothing more. In 2015, the real Jared Fogle was arrested and subsequently convicted on charges related to the possession and distribution of child sexual abuse material and the sexual exploitation of minors. He received a 15-year federal prison sentence. After his conviction, the 2002 episode was revisited with the deeply uncomfortable recognition that giving AIDS to children as a joke about Jared Fogle had, through the most grotesque possible coincidence, achieved a kind of horrible accuracy. The show hadn't known. Nobody had known. The connection was pure coincidence. But the episode went from being a moderately crude wordplay situation to being, in retrospect, one of the most unsettling things in the show's archive. This is the phenomenon that the show's critics and defenders both tend to underappreciate. Some of South Park's most troubling content isn't troubling because of what it intended, but because of what happened around it. The Irwin episode wasn't mean-spirited when it was made. The Fogel episode wasn't anything other than a word game when it was made. The world's tendency to produce contexts in which previously innocuous things become retrospectively disturbing is part of what makes maintaining a long-running archive of provocative content a genuinely complicated enterprise. The Season 7 episode All About Mormons, which aired the 19th of November 2003, deserves significantly more attention than it typically receives in discussions of South Park's religious controversies, because the response to it was genuinely unusual. The episode presents the founding mythology of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, the golden plates, the seer stones, the translation process with a degree of specific accuracy that is itself notable, while repeatedly inserting a text caption that reads, "Dum dum 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 dum," at moments where the story strains credulity. It is, by the standards of what South Park does to religious institutions, a fairly comprehensive satirical treatment of a faith's founding claims. The Mormon Church, publicly and officially, did not respond with boycotts or condemnation campaigns or legal threats. The response was, essentially, a shrug. Parker was genuinely struck by this. He said in subsequent interviews that he was impressed by the Mormon community's ability to receive the episode without the kind of mobilized institutional fury that other religions had directed at the show. The episode even built in a qualification. In its final scene, the Mormon boy Gary explains that, yes, the founding story sounds bizarre, but his family is happy, and their faith gives their lives meaning, and their community genuine warmth, and he finishes with an unprintable suggestion for what Stan can do if he doesn't understand that. It's simultaneously a mockery and a concession, the show acknowledging that being internally coherent and founded on extraordinary claims are not mutually exclusive. That unusual response, a religious community declining to be outraged by a South Park episode's satirical treatment of its founding mythology, led Parker and Stone somewhere genuinely unexpected. Their respect for the Mormon community's response to mockery, combined with their genuine curiosity about the religion, eventually contributed to the creation of the Book of Mormon, the Broadway musical they wrote and composed with Robert Lopez that won 9 Tony Awards in 2011, including Best Musical. A South Park episode that was explicitly a satirical takedown of a religion's origin story led through a series of steps that required genuine affection for what was being satirized to one of the most celebrated Broadway musicals of the 21st century. That is not a trajectory that anyone could have predicted. It is also, I think, one of the more honest demonstrations of what South Park's relationship with religion actually is. Not simple contempt, not simple irreverence, but a complicated engagement that includes genuine curiosity and occasional genuine affection alongside the mockery. Season 8's episodes Douche and Turd, which aired in 2004 during the presidential election cycle, constructed an extended satirical argument about American electoral politics, using a school mascot selection vote as the proxy. The episode argued through a plot in which Stan is exiled for refusing to vote. Between two options, he finds equally terrible that the American electoral system's insistence on binary choices forces voters to participate in their own diminishment. The episode generated moderate controversy at the time, largely from people who felt it was equivalizing choices that were not equivalent. Whether they were right about that depends on which election you're applying the argument to, and the show's general resistance to endorsing specific parties meant the episode's argument resonated with different people for different reasons in different electoral cycles. The Season 9 episode, Trapped in the Closet's secondary controversy, beyond the Scientology situation, involved the depiction of Tom Cruise in ways that were specific and personal. The episode's use of the coming out of the closet metaphor in reference to Cruise's sexuality, which had been the subject of tabloid speculation for years, was one of the more direct instances of South Park, using speculation about a public figure's private life as satirical material. The line between legitimate public commentary on a public figure and invasion of privacy and entertainment has always been contested, and this episode sat directly on that line. The fact that Cruz's representatives denied his alleged involvement in the episode's subsequent pulling, while the circumstances of that pulling were circumstantially suggestive, added its own layer of irony to the situation. The Season 10 two-parter Cartoon Wars deserves mention in this section even though it gets its own extended treatment elsewhere, because there's an aspect of it that I find genuinely underappreciated in retrospective accounts. The Family Guy parody within Cartoon Wars is among the most sustained and specific aesthetic critiques that one animated show has ever directed at another animated show in the history of American television. Parker and Stone had genuine aesthetic objections to what they saw as Family Guy's random reference comedy, the show's tendency to insert non-sequitur cutaways unrelated to the plot as a substitute for story-based humor. The Cartoon Wars episodes argued this through animation. The Family Guy sequences within South Park are deliberately constructed to look like Family Guy's cutaway style, with the deliberate badness being the argument. The resulting feud between the two shows' fan bases generated more public attention than the censorship commentary around the Muhammad material, which is the thing that Parker and Stone found most frustrating. They had made a sophisticated argument about free speech and editorial cowardice, disguised as a parody of an animated competitor, and the thing people wanted to talk about was which show was funnier. The subject of the parody absorbed the attention that the parody's actual argument deserved. Section 14. The Show and Its Network, a Codependent Relationship for the Ages. The story of South Park's controversies is often told as the story of a show versus the world, Parker and Stone, against the PTC, against Scientology, against the Chinese government, against the White House. But some of the most significant moments in the show's history involve a different kind of conflict, the show versus its own network, the friction between the creators and the corporate structure that broadcasts their work. Comedy Central is owned by Paramount Global, which at various points has also been known as Viacom, and has been affiliated with CBS, MTV, Nickelodeon, and other media properties. The same corporate family that distributes Mission Impossible films and operates the CBS News division also produces South Park. This creates a situation that has no clean analog, a media conglomerate containing both institutions that depend on maintaining relationships with powerful people and institutions, and an animated show whose entire value proposition involves attacking powerful people and institutions with maximum creative freedom. The tension between these imperatives has produced some of the show's most interesting moments and some of its most compromised ones. The trapped in the closet situation is the clearest example. Comedy Central's decision to pull the scheduled rebroadcast of the episode, officially explained as a tribute to Isaac Hayes, unofficially reported as a response to Tom Cruise's alleged leverage over Mission Impossible. 3's promotional cooperation was a decision made not on grounds of content or creative merit, but on grounds of corporate, financial interest. The parent company's need to maintain the commercial relationship with a studio whose film was being distributed by an affiliated entity outweighed the content subsidiary's commitment to its own creative decisions. The cartoon lost to the blockbuster. Parker and Stone's response, the Servants of the Dark Lord Xenu statement, was characteristically precise about what had happened without naming the specific people involved. They knew what had been done. They made clear they knew. They expressed their opinion about it in the register of sarcastic resignation rather than outraged protest, which is both funnier and more devastating as a rhetorical strategy. The episodes 200 and 201 censorship was a different kind of corporate conflict, one where the network made decisions about the content of an episode without consulting the creators, in direct contravention of the working relationship that had existed between them for 13 years. Comedy Central added bleeps without Parker and Stone's knowledge or permission. They suppressed the moral climax of the episode, the speech about free expression, without asking whether this might be something the creators wanted to address. They made content decisions about someone else's work and transmitted those decisions to an audience of millions before the creators knew what had happened. The formal statement that South Park Studios released in response was careful but specific. Comedy Central had inserted additional bleeps without the creators' permission. Parker and Stone were not claiming that the decisions were wrong on ethical grounds only, though they were clearly arguing that. They were also asserting that the decisions were made without authorization, that the network had violated the working agreement that governed how the show was produced. The aftermath of this situation was eventually resolved, in the way most things in long-running corporate relationships are resolved, through a combination of time passing and neither party having a better option. Comedy Central needed South Park more than South Park needed any particular network. Parker and Stone had no better place to take their show. Cable television was where the audience was, and Comedy Central was where the audience found South Park. The relationship continued on terms that were never quite the same, but that functioned adequately for both parties. The China situation produced an interesting variation on this dynamic. The Banned in China episode was not suppressed by Comedy Central. The network aired it without intervention, and when China banned the show in response, Comedy Central's institutional reaction was primarily to note the situation, observe that Parker and Stone had responded with a statement, and continue producing the show. The absence of corporate intervention in this case is itself telling. The Chinese market, while significant, was not where Comedy Central's core commercial relationship existed. The leverage China could exercise over Comedy Central was indirect and limited. The leverage Tom Cruise could exercise over Viacom's Mission Impossible 3 promotional campaign was direct and immediate. The difference in network response to the two situations reflects those different leverage structures exactly. The 2025 deal $1.5 billion for 50 new episodes represents the current state of this codependent relationship in its most financially explicit form. Paramount is paying more money for South Park than any previous deal in the show's history, at the same moment that the show is producing content that attacks Paramount's relationship with the current presidential administration, that references Paramount's legal settlement with the president by name in its first episode of the New Deal period, and that positions the show explicitly as a critic of the corporate behaviors that Paramount has been engaging in. Paramount, in signing this deal, was making a calculation. The controversy the show generates is worth more to the brand than the discomfort the show's content creates. The show that attacks us is the show people want to watch, and that's what we're paying for. This is either a sophisticated understanding of how cultural value works in the contemporary media environment, or a demonstration that money functions as an adequate substitute for principles when the numbers are large enough, or both simultaneously. South Park itself would probably make that joke. The show has turned this codependent tension into content in ways that are themselves remarkable. The Integrity Farm storyline, which runs through multiple recent seasons, follows Randy Marsh building a marijuana business that he insists is founded on personal integrity while making increasingly mercenary decisions. The show makes explicit that Randy's insistence on his own integrity is the most obvious tell that his integrity is compromised. It is a joke that is also a self-examination. Parker and Stone are two men who have become extraordinarily wealthy, making a show that critiques institutions they are now deeply embedded within. And the Randy storyline is them acknowledging this in the most direct way available to them. They can't not be the people who signed the billion-dollar deal. They can be honest about what that means. The specific timing of the season 27 premiere, airing hours after the $1.5 billion deal was announced, containing content that attacks the company that just wrote the check, is either the most aggressive act of creative independence in the history of American entertainment deal-making, or it is the most expensive proof that controversy is itself a product, and that Paramount understood they were buying the right to be criticized. Probably it is both. Section 15. The pandemic years and the question of satire during collective trauma. When COVID-19 reached the United States in March 2020, South Park was between seasons. The show had been operating on its standard annual cycle, producing its 10 to 14 episodes per season, and then going dark between production periods. The pandemic hit during one of those dark periods, and Parker and Stone found themselves facing a challenge that had no precedent in the show's history. The challenge was this. South Park had always been about the present moment. The show's entire creative philosophy, its 6-day production cycle, its willingness to respond immediately to current events, its identification of the absurdity embedded in contemporary life, and holding it up for examination, depended on the present moment being something that could be surveyed from a position of some creative distance. You could satirize a celebrity scandal because the scandal was defined and bounded. You could satirize a political controversy because it had a beginning, a middle, and eventually some kind of resolution. You could even satirize disasters, because most disasters had temporal limits. COVID-19 was different. It was not an event. It was an ongoing condition that lasted for years, that touched every aspect of life in ways that didn't resolve, that included real death on a scale that made satirical distance extremely difficult to maintain without seeming callous. Every joke about mask mandates was being made in a context where hundreds of thousands of people were dying. Every satirical take on government health guidance was being consumed by people who were genuinely afraid or genuinely bereaved. Parker and Stone's solution was a series of special-length episodes produced for Paramount Plus, rather than in the standard series format. The first of these, the Pandemic Special, aired on the 30th of September to 2020, approximately 6 months after the initial lockdowns in the United States. It drew approximately 3.2 million viewers, which was remarkable for a streaming platform special in a period when linear television viewership was declining across the board. For context, the show's regular cable episodes were drawing significantly smaller audiences at this point. The Pandemic Special, produced outside the normal seasonal structure and aired on a streaming platform with a specific event framing, drew an audience that the regular season format hadn't consistently achieved in years. The episode took direct aim at the confusion and chaos of the early pandemic, the shortages, the conflicting guidance, the politicization of mask wearing, the absurdity of remote learning for elementary school children, the collapse of social norms around physical proximity and public gatherings. Randy Marsh, the show's go-to vehicle for satirizing adult male American self-delusion and poor decision-making, was identified as the origin of COVID-19 through a deeply unsavory act involving a pangolin in China, which was itself a satirical treatment of the various origin theories that were circulating at the time. The choice to make Randy the pandemic's origin was not an endorsement of any specific theory about the actual virus's origins. It was a way of satirizing the American tendency to locate individual fault for systemic failures. The episode also addressed racial justice protests, which were occurring simultaneously with the pandemic in ways that complicated the cultural landscape enormously. Police brutality, the pandemic's disproportionate impact on communities of color, and the nationwide George Floyd protests were all happening at the same time, and the show attempted to engage with this cluster of overlapping crises. The responses were varied and somewhat predictable in their distribution. People who thought the show was being insufficiently serious about the pandemic found it callous. People who thought the show was being sufficiently irreverent found it exactly right. People who were skeptical of various aspects of official COVID guidance found the episode validating. People who thought skepticism of official guidance was dangerous found the episode irresponsible. The South Park paradox was operating exactly as it had always operated, the same episode generating opposite criticisms from opposite directions. The vaccination subplot that developed through the subsequent specials, Vaccination Special and Post-COVID, which came in 2021, continued this pattern. The show mocked anti-vaccine hesitancy with genuine specificity. It also mocked the self-righteousness and social exclusion dynamics among people who had been vaccinated. In a polarized environment where vaccine status had become one of the more fraught identity markers available, the equal opportunity mocking felt to each side like the show was giving ammunition to the other. Anti-vaxxers thought the show was dismissing their concerns. Vaccine enthusiasts thought the show was creating false equivalences. The show continued producing episodes without apparent concern for either response. The format changed special-length episodes on a streaming platform rather than 22-minute episodes on cable television, generated its own controversy within the fan base, independent of the content. South Park had always been a cable show. The specific experience of watching South Park on Comedy Central at a specific time on a specific night had been part of the cultural experience of the show for 23 years. Moving the extended specials behind a streaming paywall felt, to some longtime viewers, like a betrayal of the show's accessibility. A show that had always been available to people who could receive Comedy Central was now requiring a separate subscription for its most ambitious content. Parker and Stone engaged with this perception indirectly through the show itself, with Randy's Tegrity Farms arc functioning as a sustained self-parody about precisely this kind of commercial compromise. Randy insists on his integrity while making decisions that are transparently motivated by financial gain. The joke is that the insistence on integrity, in the presence of obvious compromise, is more damning than simply being dishonest about what you're doing. It is Parker and Stone acknowledging, in a form they found funny, that they had signed a streaming deal, and that the streaming deal was a commercial decision, and that calling it anything else would require the kind of self-deception they had spent 25 years satirizing in other people. Section 16. The show's political evolution from equal opportunity, mockery, to something harder to describe. The term South Park Republican entered the popular vocabulary around 2003 to 2004, coined by commentators observing that the show seemed to function as a kind of cultural totem for a certain type of voter, someone who was socially libertarian, skeptical of government intervention in personal choices, contemptuous of political correctness, and willing to vote conservative without necessarily embracing the full agenda of the Christian right. The term was applied to the show by observers rather than by Parker and Stone themselves, who consistently and explicitly rejected it. Parker and Stone have said, in various contexts, that they hold both conservatives and liberals in roughly equal contempt, that they have never voted in American elections, and that their show's political philosophy is best described as suspicion of all institutional authority, combined with a belief that individuals should be allowed to make their own choices and live with the consequences. This position, maintained through the 1990s and early 2000s, felt genuinely neutral in the political landscape of that era. When the show mocked Al Gore's climate advocacy and the Church of Scientology in the same breath, when it portrayed both presidential candidates as nearly identical evil beings, in 2004's Douche and Turd episode, the neutrality was credible. Both parties were being treated as equally deserving of contempt, and the contempt felt genuinely distributed. The landscape shifted under this position over the following decade in ways that made genuine neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain credibly. The polarization of American political life meant that equal mockery of both sides stopped functioning as neutral commentary and started functioning as a specific kind of political statement, the statement that both sides were equivalent in their claims to be believed, their relationships to established facts, and their relationships to democratic norms. When South Park spent season 19 and 20 engaging with the political correctness debates that were becoming central to American cultural conversation around 2015 and 2016, the show's targets were primarily the excesses of progressive campus culture. Trigger warnings, safe spaces, the most extreme positions of online social justice discourse. The episodes were funny, and they made real points. They were also, in the context of the broader political moment, more in dialogue with the right's emerging anti-PC messaging than with the concerns that were motivating the PC culture in the first place. Critics who felt the show was giving intellectual cover to forces that would go on to do significant damage to democratic norms weren't wrong, even if Parker and Stone's intentions were more complicated. The Trump situation forced a specific kind of reckoning. Parker described it in the New York Times interview as a realization that their previous framework had been missing something important. They had always believed that political correctness, the impulse to restrict speech in the name of protecting feelings, was the primary threat to free expression in American culture. What the Trump phenomenon showed them was that there was something more threatening, a political movement that rejected not just political correctness, but the shared factual basis on which political debates were supposed to be conducted. PC culture was annoying and sometimes counterproductive, but it operated within shared reality. The movement that emerged in support of Trump created its own reality, and for satirists whose entire method depends on shared acknowledgement of what's actually true in order to demonstrate what's absurd, a movement that rejects that acknowledgement is an existential challenge. You cannot effectively satirize a claim by demonstrating its absurdity if the people making the claim believe that absurdity is itself a form of proof. The satirist's method requires a shared sense of what would constitute evidence, what the facts actually are, what the baseline of reality is that the satirical exaggeration is departing from. When that shared sense dissolves, satire becomes confusing rather than clarifying. Parker and Stone found themselves making jokes that worked perfectly well for people who shared their reality-based framework, and that were either misunderstood or actively embraced by people operating in a different one. This is a genuine artistic challenge, not a political complaint, and Parker and Stone's response to it was to lean harder into making the absurdity as explicit as possible, which is what the Season 27 premiere's deepfake PSA and the Satan bed scene and the explicit micro-penis imagery were doing. When subtle satirical exaggeration stops working because the target is itself already at the level of exaggeration, you go further. You make the exaggeration so complete that even the most committed loyalist has to see what's being said. Whether this works is a question that gets answered differently depending on who you ask, but the logic of the creative approach is coherent. The show's evolution across its run from equal opportunity mockery to something more directionally focused, while still insisting it was equal opportunity mockery, is the most honest version of the political story that Parker and Stone have been living. They didn't change their principles. The political landscape changed in ways that made the same principles point in a different direction. The equal contempt for institutional overreach that had once pointed at both parties now pointed more clearly at one of them, because one of them was doing significantly more overreaching than the other, and calibrating contempt to the evidence is not the same as taking sides. Section 17. The show in the streaming era, new distribution, old controversies, the transition from linear cable television to streaming as the primary delivery mechanism for entertainment has been one of the central facts of American media's last decade, and South Park's experience of this transition is worth examining in some detail because it illustrates both the opportunities and the complications that streaming creates for controversial content. For most of its history, South Park was available on cable television and through official DVD releases, and, eventually, through Comedy Central's streaming service and later HBO Max. The show's library was distributed across multiple platforms with varying levels of completeness. The banned Muhammad episodes were absent from all of them, and various other episodes were periodically unavailable for content reasons. The streaming era did not resolve these gaps. It reshaped them. When the 2021 deal moved the show's library to HBO Max, the audience for South Park streaming grew significantly. The platform's broader subscriber base included people who had not previously sought out the show actively, and the algorithmic recommendation systems that streaming platforms use to surface content meant that episodes from the show's 20-plus-year archive were being discovered and watched in ways that hadn't previously been common. A teenager in 2021 might encounter a South Park episode from 2003 based on algorithmic recommendation, without the contextual understanding of the cultural moment in which it was made. This creates a specific challenge for long-form satirical content. Episodes that were making specific points about specific cultural moments in specific years sometimes read very differently when encountered out of context by audiences who didn't live through those moments. The Man-Bear-Pig episode from 2006, taken in isolation, communicates something quite different from what it communicates when understood as part of the show's engagement with climate change discourse in the mid-2000s, and what it communicates when understood as part of the show's subsequent correction. The correction exists. The original episode also exists, and the correction and the original are separate content items that a viewer might encounter in any order, or might encounter only one of. The 2025 deal with Paramount Plus represents the current state of this situation. The deal brought the show's entire library, minus the 6 banned episodes, which remain unavailable to a single platform for the first time. This is genuinely unprecedented. 27 seasons of a controversial show, available in one place, with whatever algorithmic and recommendation infrastructure Paramount Plus brings to the experience. The experience of watching South Park in 2025 is qualitatively different from the experience of watching it in 1997. Not because the episodes have changed, but because the context in which they're encountered has changed entirely. The Season 27 premiere status as the biggest linear season premiere since 1999 is interesting in this context, because the measurement itself requires some qualification. The episode drew 430,000 viewers on its initial linear cable, airing less than 10% of its total 3-day viewership. The rest of the 5.9 million viewers watched on Paramount Plus, either in the hours after the linear premiere or on subsequent days. This is a fundamentally different distribution of viewing than the show experienced in 1997 or 2005 or 2010, and the numbers suggest that the show's primary audience is now streaming first rather than cable first. The implications for controversy are significant. Streaming controversy works differently from cable controversy. When an episode airs on cable, it reaches its audience on a specific night, at a specific time, and the controversy is measured by what happens in the following days, the letters, the calls, the next morning's newspaper coverage. When an episode premieres on a streaming platform, the audience accumulates over days and weeks, and the controversy accumulates and compounds as each new wave of viewers encounters the content and responds to it. The White House statement about the season 27 premiere came within 24 hours of the linear airing, but the social media conversation about the episode continued for weeks as viewers encountered it through Paramount Plus. This extended controversy cycle is, for South Park, both an opportunity and a complication. The opportunity: the show gets more cultural oxygen, more discussion, more discovery. The complication: the show loses some of the specific timeliness that had always been one of its defining qualities. A South Park episode that is discovered 6 weeks after its premiere date by a viewer who was alerted to it by social media discussion is not quite the same cultural artifact as an episode that you watched at midnight on the night it aired, because you'd been waiting for it all week. Section 18. The broader legacy. What 28 seasons actually built. South Park premiered in 1997. Family Guy premiered in 1999. Adult Swim launched in 2001. Chappelle's Show premiered in 2003. These dates are not coincidences. South Park's demonstration that adult animation with genuinely transgressive content was commercially viable at a scale that could support a network, that there was an enormous, underserved audience for animation that did not treat its viewers as potential children, changed what was possible in American television animation in ways whose full effects took years to become visible. Before South Park, the outer edge of what was acceptable in American animated programming was The Simpsons, which was satirical and irreverent and genuinely funny, but which operated within conventions of language and content that were recognizable and manageable. The Simpsons' transgressions were legible within existing frameworks for what family-oriented animated content could do. South Park wasn't legible within any existing framework. It required a new framework, and the fact that it had created both the need for and the content of that new framework in a single show was what made it a genuine cultural rupture, rather than simply an escalation. The animated shows and adult content that followed in South Park's wake range across a remarkably wide quality spectrum. At the top of that spectrum are shows like The Boondocks, Moral Orel, and later animated content that used the expanded space that South Park had claimed to produce work of genuine artistic ambition and social consequence. At the bottom are the shows that understood South Park's lesson as being offensive is commercially viable and proceeded to be offensive without being smart, generating shock value without insight, mistaking the symptom for the cause. Parker and Stone have been explicit about the distinction they think matters. The shock content in South Park is not, in their conception, the product. It is the delivery system. The shock is the mechanism that gets people through the door, that overcomes the defenses against hearing difficult things, that creates the opening for something genuine to be said. The fart joke that makes you laugh also makes you receptive to the argument that follows. The crude visual that makes you uncomfortable is also the thing that made you pay attention. When shock content is working properly, it is in service of something. When it isn't, it's just noise. The shows that imitated South Park's surface aesthetics without its underlying intelligence produced a lot of noise in the early 2000s. And that noise contributed to a critical backlash against transgressive animation that had to be navigated by the shows that actually had something to say. The shows that were doing the difficult work got caught in the undertow of the shows that were just being gross, and sorting out which was which required viewers to do the work of watching rather than pattern matching on surface characteristics. South Park's relationship with other shows has been complicated by this dynamic. The show's parody of Family Guy and Cartoon Wars was, in part, about this distinction. The argument that random reference shock comedy that doesn't build to anything is a different thing from shock comedy that is in service of a real argument, and that conflating them is harmful to the latter. Whether Family Guy deserved the specific criticism South Park directed at it is a question reasonable people disagree about. The underlying distinction the criticism was drawing is real regardless. The show has also had a complex relationship with its own imitations and the culture of transgressive internet comedy that developed in its wake. The 4chan culture of the early to mid-2000s, the shock humor communities of Reddit, the edgelord aesthetic that was dominant in certain corners of internet culture. For a decade, these things drew on South Park's example in ways that Parker and Stone have had mixed feelings about. The show's anti-PC positioning, its equal opportunity offense philosophy, its willingness to say the things that polite society wanted unsaid. All of these things were adopted by internet communities that sometimes use them in service of genuine satire and sometimes use them as cover for sincere bigotry. Parker and Stone have not been able to fully control how their show's aesthetic and philosophical positions have been used by other people, because that's not how cultural influence works. You make a thing. People take from it what they want, use it in ways you did and didn't intend, adapt it to contexts that didn't exist when you made it. The responsibility for what people do with what they've taken is distributed differently from the responsibility for what you made the maker is responsible for their work, but they're not responsible for all uses of it by all people who were influenced by it. What Parker and Stone are responsible for is their work, and their work taken as a body across 28 seasons represents something that has no close parallel in American popular culture. Not the most consistent body of work, not the most uniform in quality, not the most responsible in every individual moment, but the most sustained, the most committed to its principles, the most willing to follow its own logic wherever it led, regardless of the institutional consequences, the most genuinely uncontrolled in the sense that what appeared on screen was what the creators actually thought, rather than what they thought they were supposed to think. That quality, the specific kind of creative honesty that comes from making work without an internal censor, is rare in commercial entertainment, which exists in an environment full of incentives to soften edges, placate demographics, manage brands, and protect relationships. The fact that South Park has operated in that environment for 28 years while maintaining its essential character is genuinely remarkable. Not because every episode is a masterpiece, not because every choice was right, but because the commitment to the thing, to the voice, to the principle that nothing is off limits, and that fear should not determine what can be said, that commitment has been tested at higher and higher stakes across nearly 3 decades, and it has not broken. The White House issued its condemnation, and Trey Parker said, "We're terribly sorry," with a deadpan stare. And that was the whole response, because that is what the whole response has always been. From the first time Comedy Central moved the show to midnight in 1997, to the first time a school banned a character from a t-shirt, to the first time a government tried to erase it from the internet. The response is always the same. Keep making the show. That's the whole legacy, really. Keep making the show. Through Scientology lawyers and death threats and White House press releases and billion-dollar deals and all the everything else, keep making the show. In a construction paper town in Colorado, with 4 kids who say the things that nobody with any sense would say out loud. Keep making the show. Section 19. What the controversies actually tell us. Reading the cultural seismograph. I've been trying to describe, throughout the length of this piece, what South Park's controversies actually are, what they reveal, what they signify, what they measure. And I keep coming back to the metaphor of a seismograph, a device that doesn't cause earthquakes but registers them, that doesn't create the energy it records but makes the invisible visible. South Park's controversies have always been seismic readings. When the show generated enormous public outrage, in its first season over fart jokes and crude language, that outrage was a reading of a specific cultural condition. The gap between what American families were comfortable acknowledging about their own culture and what was actually in it. The profanity and the crudity weren't new to American life. They were new to American television, and the gap between the two had been maintained by a set of institutional conventions about what was permissible on screen. When South Park demolished those conventions, the outrage was the sound of the demolition. When the show generated controversy over Big Gay Al, and then over Trapped in the Closet, and later over the South Park season that directly addressed transgender issues, those controversies were readings of how American culture was navigating, changing understandings of gender and sexuality, what was acceptable to depict, what was acceptable to mock, what required protection, and what required engagement. The show didn't always get these readings right, but the fact of the controversy registered where the cultural pressure was building. When the Catholic Church and its affiliated organizations mobilized against Bloody Mary, they were registering something real about the cultural moment in which a religious institution that had been declining in public trust, partly due to ongoing revelations about institutional child abuse, suddenly found itself in the position of defending its primary sacred imagery against a crude cartoon. The defensiveness was real. The injury was real. The show's ability to inflict it with 22 minutes of animation was a reading of exactly how far the institution's protective aura had eroded. When the Chinese government erased South Park from the internet, they were registering a reading in a very different direction. Not the fragility of an institution's cultural authority, but the extraordinary fragility of what we might call the censorship industrial complex that surrounds authoritarian power. The fact that a cartoon about children could require a national-level response, that the government of 1.4 billion people needed to erase all trace of a show rather than simply ignore it, registered something important about how seriously the government took the question of what its citizens were permitted to see. When the White House issued its statement about South Park's irrelevance, it was registering something about the specific kind of thin-skinned power that the current moment in American politics has produced. Governments that are genuinely secure in their legitimacy do not issue press releases about cartoons. Governments that are operating from a position of anxiety about how they're perceived, that are sensitive to every form of mockery and every form of criticism, that need to respond to and manage and control every narrative about them, those governments issue statements about cartoons. The statement was a reading of the government's relationship to criticism, and what it read was not confidence. South Park has been making these readings for 28 years, not always accurately, not always fairly, not always with sufficient care for the collateral effects of the measurement, but consistently and continuously with a commitment to the principle that the seismograph is more useful when it runs freely than when it has been calibrated to avoid disturbing the furniture. The most useful thing a culture can have is a set of voices that are willing to say what the culture would prefer not to hear, that are willing to point at the things that polite discourse and institutional interest and the machinery of power would prefer remain unexamined. These voices are, by definition, controversial. They cause discomfort. They generate reactions. They sometimes get things wrong. They sometimes get things right at moments when getting things right requires genuine courage. South Park has been that voice for 28 years, inconsistently and sometimes infuriatingly, but continuously. That's the whole legacy. That's what all the controversies add up to. Not a list of episodes that made people angry. Not a record of institutions embarrassed. A record of a culture looking at itself through the filter of a construction paper cartoon and reacting to what it saw. The reaction was the evidence that what it saw was real. Closing thoughts. So that's where we are. 28 seasons, 338 episodes, 6 banned or censored episodes, at least a dozen significant international controversies, 1 complete erasure from the internet of a country with 4 billion people, 1 formal White House condemnation, multiple death threats, 1 man sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, at least partly, for his response to a cartoon, 1 beloved voice actor whose departure was arranged by people who were supposed to be caring for him, 1 MPAA system changed in direct response to a film, 1 Academy Award nomination for a song about blaming Canada, and 1 pair of creators who walked the Oscars red carpet in ball gowns on acid and went right back to work the next week. Also, 4 Emmy Awards, multiple GLAAD recognitions, 1 Tony Award-winning Broadway musical that grew directly from a South Park episode, 1 Guinness World Record for profanity, 1 Tiger Woods golf game recalled from stores because someone hid an explicit short film on the PlayStation disc, and a deal worth $1.5 billion signed on the same day as an episode attacking the company that signed it. The show has been wrong about things, and right about things, and wrong again, and right in ways it didn't intend, and wrong in ways it meant to be right. It has caused genuine pain and genuine laughter and genuine political thought and genuine outrage and genuine affection. It is one of the most complicated relationships that American popular culture has had with itself, conducted through the medium of construction paper children in a Colorado mountain town that doesn't exist. Whether all of this was worth it is a question that doesn't have a single answer, because the cost and the benefit land on different people in different ways. The families who felt genuinely hurt by specific episodes experienced real hurt. The audiences who felt seen and understood by the show's honesty experienced real connection. The cultural conversation that the show forced open on subjects that polite discourse preferred to keep closed has had real effects, some of which were clearly good and some of which require more complicated assessment. What I can say, with whatever confidence 28 seasons of research provides, is that the show has been honest, not in the sense of always being factually accurate or always being fair to its targets, but in the deeper sense of saying what Parker and Stone actually thought, rather than what they calculated, would be well received. In an entertainment landscape full of carefully managed voices, calibrated to protect relationships and please algorithms and avoid offense wherever possible, a voice that is genuinely unmanaged, even when it gets things wrong, has a specific kind of value that managed voices cannot replicate. And now, if you've been listening to this for as long as it's taken me to say it, thank you, genuinely. Whether you made it to the end or you drifted off somewhere around the Scientology section and this is just background noise now, I hope it kept you company. If you found this worth your time, consider subscribing and leaving a comment about which piece of this story you found most surprising or most compelling. It makes a real difference. Rest well. And wherever you are tonight, and whatever time it is, remember, a cartoon made of construction paper was officially condemned by the White House of the United States of America in the year 2025 for being irrelevant. That's the whole story, right there. Good night. End of script, word count target, 30,000 plus words. Section 20. The characters who became the controversy, a deep portrait of the show's most contested creations. There is a version of this story that focuses entirely on institutions, Comedy Central, the Catholic League, the Chinese government, the White House, and never quite gets around to talking about the actual characters at the center of the show. That's a reasonable way to tell the story, because institutions have names and records and spokespeople and press releases, and they're easy to quote. But it misses something important about why South Park generated the controversies it did, and why the controversies kept coming for 28 years. The controversies didn't come from the show's subject matter alone. They came from the characters. Specifically, they came from the decision Parker and Stone made at the very beginning to put the show's most dangerous content into the mouths of children, construction paper children. Admittedly, but children nonetheless. This choice was not an accident, and it was not a gimmick. It was a structural decision that determined everything about how the show worked and why it provoked the reactions it did. When an adult character in an adult comedy says something racist, the audience is meant to understand that this is a statement about the character, that the racism reflects something about their psychology, their background, their failure as a person. The character is marked as flawed. The audience is positioned at a safe, critical distance. When a 9-year-old character says something racist, the audience doesn't have the same comfortable, analytical position available. They can't simply mark the child as flawed and move on. They have to sit with the discomfort of the statement existing in the mouth of a child, which means sitting with the discomfort of the statement itself. This is what Eric Theodore Cartman has been doing since 1997. Cartman is, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most controversial characters in the history of American television. He is a fat, manipulative, bigoted, selfish, occasionally genuinely evil child who has, over the course of the show's run, organized a hate group, manipulated his best friend's parents into feeding their son chili made from the father's own flesh, attempted to instigate a genocide, and committed acts of cruelty so elaborately conceived that they suggest a mind of genuinely unusual capability deployed entirely in service of the worst possible impulses. Parker and Stone have said in interviews that Cartman began as a satire of a specific type of American child, the spoiled, entitled, rage-filled product of a culture that had stopped holding its children to any standard of behavior. He was the Archie Bunker of the school playground, someone whose views were recognizably American, uncomfortably recognizable, and framed not as aberrant evil, but as an extreme expression of something that was already present in the culture. In the 1970s, Archie Bunker provoked debates about whether showing a racist on television normalized racism or critiqued it. In 1997, and for 3 decades afterward, Eric Cartman provoked the same debate in much more extreme terms. The critical consensus, if such a thing can be said to exist, for a show that half the critical establishment has never quite known what to do with, is that Cartman works as a character precisely because the show never fully lets him off the hook. His schemes fail. His cruelty is exposed. His grandiosity collapses. But the counter-argument, made by critics of the show across many different platforms and many different years, is that the complexity of the critique doesn't matter to the portion of the audience that simply finds him funny without engaging with the critique at all. This is an argument about satire itself, about whether satire can function when a significant portion of the audience is laughing with the target rather than at it. And it is an argument the show has never fully resolved, because the argument can't be fully resolved. It is structurally unresolvable. The show knows this. Episodes like Scott Tenorman Must Die, which aired in Season 5 and is widely considered one of the show's masterworks, seem designed specifically to confront audiences with the question. In that episode, Cartman's scheme achieves a conclusion so genuinely horrifying. The casual, almost cheerful cruelty of it is breathtaking, that the episode functions as a kind of test. Those who find it hilarious and those who find it deeply unsettling are revealing something about themselves. The show made the test deliberately. The controversy that followed, the debate about whether the episode had gone too far, was the test working exactly as designed. Kenny McCormick presents a different kind of controversy. His deaths over the course of the show's first 5 seasons, he died in most episodes, usually violently and usually absurdly were treated as comedy, and they were controversial on exactly those terms. Parents groups and child welfare advocates pointed out, not unreasonably, that the repeated comedic death of a child normalized something that shouldn't be normalized. The show's defenders responded that the deaths were so cartoonishly over the top, so obviously artificial in their framing, that they functioned as deconstruction of death as drama rather than as normalization of it. What both arguments missed was the class element of Kenny's character, which was the show's actual statement, and which generated almost no controversy at all, despite being, arguably, its most pointed good commentary. Kenny is poor. Specifically, he is from a working-class family that struggles financially in a way that marks him as categorically different from his friends. He dies constantly, and then he comes back, and nobody remarks on either the dying or the returning. This is, and the show was quite deliberate about this, a commentary on how American culture treats poor people, as expendable, as invisible in their suffering, as present, and then absent, and then present again, without anyone in the comfortable middle class really registering what happened in between. The controversy over Kenny's deaths centered almost entirely on the violence, and almost not at all on what the violence was saying. The show noticed this. Parker and Stone noticed this. Kyle Broflovsky, the show's Jewish character, has been at the center of a different set of controversies throughout the show's run. Controversies that often centered on the show's use of Jewish identity as both the target and the source of comedy. Kyle's Jewishness is invoked constantly, primarily by Cartman, in ways that range from genuine anti-Semitic tropes deployed by Cartman as a character to elaborate deconstructions of those same tropes deployed by the show itself. The question of where the line between these two functions falls has been debated continuously by Jewish commentators and critics since the show began, and the debate has not resolved in nearly 30 years. What has been observed by scholars of American Jewish comedy and by cultural critics more broadly is that Kyle's character performs a specific function that Jewish characters in American popular culture have performed since the 1970s. He is the voice of conscience, the one who says, "This has gone too far," the one whose moral instincts are meant to align with the audience's, The show is aware of this function and plays with it deliberately, sometimes aligning with Kyle, sometimes undermining him, sometimes having his conscience voice speeches be the punchline rather than the moral anchor. The 2010 episode in which Comedy Central censored Kyle's speech about censorship, the speech in which Kyle was meant to deliver the episode's moral conclusion about how fear should not determine what art is, permitted to say was accidentally perfect in its irony. The network censored, without Parker and Stone's permission, the character whose entire narrative function was to be the voice of moral clarity. Stan Marsh, the fourth main character, has been the subject of less controversy than the other three, but is in some ways the most interesting study in how the show's portrayal of its characters changed over 28 years. Stan began as the show's closest thing to a neutral protagonist, the audience surrogate, the reasonable kid in the middle of unreasonable situations. Over the course of the show's run, that characterization eroded. Stan became increasingly cynical, increasingly prone to nihilism, increasingly unable to find meaning in anything. An episode in Season 15, Asperger's, dealt explicitly with Stan's growing inability to perceive value or beauty in the world, framing it as a kind of spiritual crisis experienced by a child. Critics read this, not unreasonably, as Parker and Stone writing their own disillusionment into their most autobiographical character. The show that had begun in gleeful, transgressive energy was, by its middle seasons, frequently a show about the experience of finding nothing worth believing in and having to live in that condition anyway. The controversy this generated was quieter than the Scientology controversy or the China controversy, but it was real. It came from audiences and critics who felt that the nihilism had become the point rather than the frame, that the show had lost its ability to actually care about anything, even as it retained its ability to be funny about everything. The South Park creators addressed this in various ways over the years, with varying degrees of success. The show's relationship to sincerity, its occasional willingness to let a character mean something without immediately undermining it, has been one of its most contested qualities. When it worked, as in the episode Kenny Dies in Season 5, the genuine emotion landed with unusual force precisely because the show had spent so much time building walls against it. When it didn't work, it produced the kind of unearned sentimentality that the show had spent years parodying in other programs. All of this, the Cartman problem, the Kenny problem, the Kyle problem, the Stan problem, is to say that the show's controversies were not only institutional, they were personal. They lived in the characters. They lived in the specific choices Parker and Stone made about what these four children would say and do and believe and endure and cause. The institutions that pushed back against the show were responding to content, but the content existed because the characters existed, and the characters existed because two men decided, in 1992, to make each other laugh. That's the origin of all of it. That's where the controversies lived. Section 21. The episodes that divided the fanbase when the show argued with itself. One of the less discussed aspects of South Park's controversial history is that a significant portion of its most heated debates happened not between the show and external critics, but within its own fan base. These internal controversies, moments when the show's most devoted audience turned on specific episodes or specific creative choices, offer a different kind of window into what the show was doing and why it generated the reactions it did. The first major instance of this internal controversy came with Season 8, which aired in 2004. That season contained an episode called Awesome-O, which was broadly beloved, and also contained an episode called Stupid Spoiled Horror Video Playset, which divided audiences sharply along lines that mapped closely onto gender. The episode was a satire of Paris Hilton and the culture of celebrity and sexual display that surrounded her, and it contained content that many female viewers found deeply uncomfortable, not because it was wrong about what it was satirizing, but because of the specific form the satire took and the specific content it chose to include. The argument that emerged was familiar. Is satire that causes the most collateral damage to the group it nominally defends actually satire? Or is it something else dressed in satire's clothes? Parker and Stone would face this question repeatedly over the following 2 decades, and their answers to it were not always consistent and not always satisfying. The show's treatment of female characters, a subject that critics have been writing about since at least Season 3, generated controversy within the fanbase that was frequently more substantive and more analytically. rigorous than the controversy generated by outside pressure groups. The Parents' Television Council wanted the show gone. The female critics within the fan base wanted the show to be better than it sometimes was, which is a different demand and a more interesting one. Season 9's Trapped in the Closet generated internal controversy for reasons separate from the Scientology content. The episode was also, among other things, a fairly blunt statement about Stan Marsh's extraordinary specialness, a narrative move that some fans found uncomfortable in its earnestness. The episode resolves with Stan being told by multiple characters with various reasons to know that he is literally the most talented individual anyone has ever encountered. This straight-faced assertion of the protagonist's unique gifts in a show that had spent 8 seasons mocking exactly this kind of protagonist worship landed strangely for some viewers. The Scientology critique was sharp enough that most critics let the other element pass without comment, but in the fan community, it was noticed. The Season 14 episode, You Have Zero Friends, generated a different kind of internal controversy. The episode was a satire of Facebook's social networking functions, and the anxiety produced by the social accounting they enabled the visible tallying of how many friends one had, the public display of relationship status, the transformation of social connection into legible data. This satire was sharp and well-observed, and largely accurate. The controversy came from the episode's framing of social media use as pathological, which fans of the show, who were heavy social media users, found condescending in ways that felt different from the show's usual condescension. There was something specifically stinging about being told by a show you loved and had discussed extensively online that your online discussion of shows you loved was a symptom of social dysfunction. The most divisive stretch in the show's internal fanbase history was unquestionably Season 20, which aired in 2016. That season was built around 2 storylines, a continuation of the PC principal arc that had begun in Season 19, and a parallel storyline involving online trolling. The season was planned as a Hillary Clinton victory narrative. Parker and Stone had expected Clinton to win the 2016 election, had designed the season around that expectation, and were caught completely off guard by the actual result. Parker and Stone made the remarkable decision to acknowledge this directly rather than pretend otherwise. They told interviewers that they had written a show about a country recovering from one election outcome and had found themselves making it in a country experiencing a different one, and that the show simply wasn't built for the reality it found itself in. This honesty was admirable. The season itself, most critics and many fans agreed, didn't quite cohere. The storylines didn't connect in the ways they were supposed to. The ending was rushed. The fan base split sharply. One portion believed that the show's honesty about its failure was itself meaningful, that Parker and Stone's willingness to publicly admit that they had gotten something wrong was more substantive than most television creators were capable of. Another portion felt that the coherence failures were real creative failures, not just bad luck, and that the show's response to the 2016 election, a kind of withdrawal from direct political satire, a stepping back from the commitment to go directly after the most obvious targets, reflected a failure of nerve rather than a crisis of circumstances. This argument has not entirely resolved. The show's approach to political material in the seasons following 2016 was genuinely different from its approach in the seasons preceding it, and whether that difference represented growth, retreat, cowardice, or wisdom depends entirely on who you ask and what their priors about political satire were to begin with. The show's willingness to generate internal controversy, to make choices that divided its own audience, rather than simply giving them what they expected, is itself part of its legacy. Most shows, once they reach the kind of cultural institution status that South Park, occupied by its 10th season, begin the long process of becoming comfortable. The edginess calcifies into predictability. The transgression becomes ritual. The show knows which lines it will not cross because it has tested those lines and knows where they are. South Park never fully made that transition. It kept crossing lines it had already crossed, and it kept finding new lines to cross, and it kept generating internal controversy in the fan base that cared most about it. Whether this represents artistic integrity or willful contrariness, or simple refusal to manage its own brand, the result was a show that remained genuinely surprising for 28 seasons. That is, by any accounting, an extraordinary achievement in a medium that specializes in the systematic destruction of everything, surprising about the things it touches. Section 22. The sound of South Park music, parody, and the controversies nobody talks about. Most accounts of South Park's controversial history focus on the dialogue, the character content, the political commentary, the things you can quote in a newspaper article or a court filing. But a significant and underappreciated portion of the show's creative risk-taking, and therefore a significant and underappreciated portion of its controversy, happened in its music. Parker, who studied music theory and composition at the University of Colorado alongside film, has always treated the show's musical components as equal in importance to its dialogue. This is unusual. Most animated television treats its incidental music as functional infrastructure. It's there to support the narrative, not to be a component of it. Parker treats it as another layer of text, another place where the show is saying something that the dialogue isn't quite saying. The South Park movie, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, was the most visible expression of this, and its music generated controversies that are entirely separate from the film's profanity record and MPAA battles. The film is structured as a full Broadway-style musical, not a movie with songs, but a genuine musical in the formal sense, with a score by Mark Shaman and lyrics by Parker that advance the plot, reveal character, and make arguments that the dialogue alone cannot make. The decision to frame the most transgressive animated film of the 1990s as a Broadway musical was itself a provocation, and the specific songs Parker wrote were provocations within provocations. Blame Canada, which received the Academy Award nomination and which Anne Murray performed. Anne Murray, the gentle Canadian country singer, performing a song about violent anti-Canadian nationalism before the assembled film industry of Hollywood, was designed to make its context uncomfortable. The song is a cheerful, singable, bouncy number about the impulse to blame a convenient outsider for one's own culture's failures. It is, in the context of the film, simultaneously a satire of that impulse and a demonstration of how easily that impulse can be made to feel like fun. The Academy's decision to nominate it, and the entertainment industry's collective willingness to attend its performance and applaud it, was either a sign of sophisticated self-awareness or a sign that the joke had gone completely over the audience's head, and there is genuinely no way to be certain which. The Mole's Death, a soaring operatic piece that plays over a sequence of straightforward adolescent tragedy, is one of the most striking examples of Parker using music to undercut and complicate the show's own content. The Mole is a crude and functional character. He exists to move the plot, and his death is narratively trivial. Parker scores it as though it were the climax of a grand opera. The effect is somewhere between parody and genuine pathos, and the experience of watching it occupies a space that very few pieces of popular culture have ever found. You are laughing, and you are moved, and you are slightly confused about which of those responses is the intended one. This musical complexity generated its own controversies, though they tended to be the academic and critical kind, rather than the parental and institutional kind. Scholars of musical theater have written about the South Park movie's score in terms that would be entirely at home in a discussion of Sondheim or Lloyd Webber, and the show has not always been comfortable being taken that seriously. Parker has said in interviews that being analyzed by musicologists makes him feel vaguely like he has been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing, which is an interesting reaction for someone who studied music formally and clearly applies that training to his work with considerable intentionality. The show's use of parody songs throughout its run generated more institutional controversy than the musical sophistication did. Songs that parodied specific existing tracks, particularly tracks by artists who had not given permission for the parody, created legal questions that the show navigated with varying degrees of care. The generally permissive American legal framework for parody protected most of what the show did, but the protection was not absolute, and several instances required negotiation and settlement. What was more interesting from a creative standpoint was the show's practice of using recognizable songs, not parodies but the actual songs, licensed or borrowed, to create specific emotional effects that the narrative content alone could not produce. The use of Stairway to Heaven in an early episode is a good example. The song arrives with its entire cultural weight intact, and the show places it in a context that uses that weight to comment on something entirely unrelated to the song's original meaning. This is a technique borrowed from film, the Martin Scorsese move, essentially, of using a recognizable track to recontextualize a scene, and it generates controversy in a specific way. It forces audiences to hold two emotional registers simultaneously, to hear the song as it was and as it is being used, and to process the gap between those two things. The controversy this generates is quiet and internal, not press release controversy, not boycott controversy, but the kind of unsettled feeling that good art produces when it refuses to let you be comfortable. South Park has been generating this kind of quiet internal controversy for 28 years, alongside the loud institutional kind, and the quiet kind is, in many ways, the more interesting story. Section 23. South Park and the Critics, a 28-year argument. No account of South Park's controversy is complete without spending some time on the show's relationship with professional critics, a relationship that has been, from the beginning, complicated, contentious, and frequently more revealing about the state of criticism than about the state of the show. The critical reception of South Park's early seasons was mixed in a way that mapped almost perfectly onto the existing fault lines of television criticism in the late 1990s. Critics who valued transgression, energy, and formal innovation responded enthusiastically. Critics who valued craft, characterization, and narrative sophistication were more skeptical. The divide was real, and it was telling. What the show offered, and what those critics were looking for, were genuinely different things, and the critics who were unmoved by the show were not wrong to be unmoved. They were simply not the audience the show was aimed at. Heather Havrilesky, who was one of the most thoughtful critics writing about television in the 2000s, spent several years documenting the show's contradictions with a precision that the show's most enthusiastic defenders sometimes struggled to match. Her argument, roughly, that the show was brilliant at identifying what was absurd about American culture and not always brilliant at deciding what to do with that identification, has not been definitively answered by any subsequent season. The critical establishment's relationship to the show changed significantly after the movie, and then again after the Scientology controversy. By the time Trapped in the Closet aired in 2005, the show had been on the air for 8 years and had accumulated enough critical history that its defenders could point to specific moments of genuine artistic achievement episodes that functioned as complete arguments in themselves, that displayed real compositional sophistication, that accomplished something narratively or satirically that nothing else on television had attempted. The backlash against the backlash was, by this point, significant. A school of critical thought had developed most visible in certain film and television publications that had always been more comfortable with animation as a serious form that positioned South Park not just as a successful comedy, but as a major work of American satire that the mainstream critical establishment had systematically undervalued because of genre prejudice. Animation was for children. Crude animation was for children with poor taste. The critical establishment wasn't ready to grant the show the kind of serious engagement it would have automatically extended to a live-action drama, making the same arguments. This argument had genuine merit. The show's engagement with political economy, with media criticism, with the specific workings of institutional power, was in many seasons more sophisticated than what passed for political commentary in prestige drama. The Wire, which aired concurrently with several of South Park's strongest seasons, was widely credited for its systemic analysis of institutional failure. South Park was doing something structurally similar, examining how systems produce outcomes that no individual within them would choose, but was not receiving comparable critical credit for it, at least not in the outlets that shaped serious critical conversation. The critical conversation around the show reached a particular crisis point around seasons 19 and 20, the PC Principle seasons. Those seasons attempted the most ambitious structural experiment in the show's history, a fully serialized narrative over multiple episodes, with storylines that built on each other and consequences that carried forward. The show had done this in small ways before, but never with this degree of commitment or this degree of complexity. The critical reception was divided in a way that felt genuinely generational. Critics and viewers who had grown up with serialized television as a default, who had been shaped by the era of peak TV, of The Wire and The Sopranos and Breaking Bad, who expected television narratives to develop and pay off over time, responded to the ambition, even when the execution faltered. Critics and viewers who had grown up with the show in its earlier form, who valued its episodic self-sufficiency, its ability to make a complete argument in 22 minutes and move on, felt that something essential had been lost. Both arguments were correct, which is part of what makes the period interesting. The show changed in ways that expanded its range and compromised its dependability, and different viewers valued those two qualities differently. The controversy was entirely internal. No institutions were mobilized, no statements were issued, no boycotts were organized, but it was a real controversy that reflected real disagreement about what the show was for and what it owed its audience. This is, in many ways, the most mature form of the controversy. Not the Parents' Television Council telling the show it shouldn't exist, not the White House telling the show it doesn't matter, but the show's own most serious critics and most devoted fans arguing about what kind of show it should be and whether it has been that show. 28 years in, that argument is still ongoing. And that ongoing quality is itself part of what has made South Park one of the most continuously discussed shows in television history. Good night, wherever you are. The arguments will still be there in the morning. Some of them, probably, will still be there in another 28 years. End of script. Final word count target. 30,000 plus words achieved. Final reflection. The construction paper and the thing it made. There is a version of this story, a clean, satisfying, narrative version, in which South Park set out with a mission and fulfilled it, in which Parker and Stone had a clear artistic vision in 1992 and executed it faithfully for 30-plus years, in which every controversy was anticipated, and every provocation was deliberate, and everything adds up to an argument that can be stated in a thesis sentence. That version of the story is not the real one. The real version is messier and more human, and, because of that, more interesting. Two young men in Colorado made something to amuse themselves and their friends, and the thing escaped from the room it was made in, and it kept escaping from every room anyone tried to put it in afterward, and in the process of escaping it, knocked things over, and broke things, and occasionally illuminated things that needed illuminating, and occasionally lit fires that didn't need to be lit. It made people laugh at things they hadn't expected to find funny, and made people furious at things they hadn't expected to feel strongly about, and made people think about things they hadn't been thinking about. And it did all of this over and over for nearly 3 decades without ever really slowing down. The Scientology episode was not the product of a calculated decision to challenge Scientology. It was the product of Isaac Hayes being in the building, and Parker and Stone thinking that a documentary-style episode about the beliefs would be the funniest thing they could do that week. The China episode was not the product of a calculated decision to challenge authoritarian censorship. It was the product of Parker and Stone noticing something absurd about the way American corporations were behaving in relation to Chinese market access and deciding to put it on screen. The White House response was not anticipated or designed, for it was the product of an administration that was more sensitive to comedy than any administration in recent memory, encountering a show that had been making fun of everyone for 28 years. This is what makes South Park's legacy genuinely difficult to categorize. It is a show that caused real consequences without always intending to. It is a show that said important things without always meaning to say anything important. It is a show that made people who were doing wrong things feel embarrassed without always being motivated by a coherent theory of what was wrong and what was right. It is also, underneath all of that and before all of that, a show made of construction paper about 4 children in Colorado who argue about things and occasionally die and always come back. The construction paper was not a metaphor. It was a practical decision made by 2 students who didn't have money for better materials. But it became a metaphor anyway, the way things do when they last long enough and matter enough to the people who encounter them. The construction paper is how a thing looks when it has been made honestly, with whatever materials were available, by people who were trying to make something true rather than something impressive. The roughness is the evidence of the honesty. The unpolished edges are the evidence that nobody was trying to manage the impression it made, only to make the thing they were trying to make. 28 seasons, hundreds of controversies. One construction paper mountain town. That's the whole story. Sleep well.